Edgar Kincaid's voice carried like a whip crack across the crowded depot platform. That is not the woman I sent money for. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't pull her aside. He stood in front of every soul in Blackstone Crossing, the merchants, the ranch hands, the women clutching their Sunday hats against the autumn wind. And he pointed at Naomi Mercer like she was a broken piece of livestock delivered to the wrong address. His finger hung in the air, his face twisted with the kind of contempt that didn't need to search for words because it had rehearsed them 1,000 times in the mirror of its own arrogance. Look at her. She's plain as a fence post and twice as worn. Laughter broke across the platform like glass shattering on stone. Naomi stood absolutely still, her worn suitcase gripped in both hands, her chin refusing, by sheer stubbornness, to drop. If this story already has your heart beating faster, you're exactly who it was made for. Subscribe to the channel and follow every episode because this story is only beginning, and what comes next will surprise you completely. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us the city and country where you're watching. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now stay with me. Because the most important moment on that platform wasn't the cruelty. It was what happened next. The morning had started the way most mornings start when everything is about to change, quietly, without any signal of what was coming. Naomi Mercer had been awake since before the train reached the final ridge above Blackstone Valley. She'd pressed her face close to the smudged window glass and watched the land open up below her, wide grassland, timber ridges, a river that caught the low October sun and threw it back in pieces. It was beautiful in the way that only places you've never been can be beautiful, full of promise that hasn't had time to disappoint you yet. She hadn't slept properly in 2 days. Her back ached from the bench seat. The bread she'd brought from the boarding house in Cheyenne had gone stiff, and the last of it sat wrapped in cloth at the bottom of her bag, next to the letter she had read so many times. The fold lines had worn nearly through. She pulled the letter out now, even though she didn't need to read it again. Dear Miss Mercer, I am a rancher of modest but honest means. I have 2 daughters, 7 years old, twins, who lost their mother 18 months ago. I am not a man of many words, but I am a man of my word. I need a wife capable of hard work and genuine care. I am told you are both. If that is true, that is enough for me. Edgar Kincaid, Blackstone Crossing, Wyoming Territory. She had answered that letter 3 months ago from the women's boarding house in Cheyenne, where she had been working as a laundress since leaving Ohio. She was 30 years old. She was not beautiful in the way that made men turn their heads in the street. She knew that. She had always known it. But she had also learned, through 10 years of surviving on her own after her parents died, that beauty was the most overrated currency in a world that actually ran on endurance. She folded the letter and put it back in the bag. The train lurched as it slowed into the station. Naomi straightened her collar, checked that her hair was as decent as it was going to get after 2 days of travel, and picked up her suitcase. The depot platform at Blackstone Crossing was packed. She hadn't expected that. She'd imagined a quiet arrival, maybe the rancher waiting alone with a wagon, the kind of awkward handshake introduction that happened between 2 practical strangers deciding to be practical together. Instead, there was a crowd. Market day, she realized. Half the valley must have come to town. She stepped off the train and looked around. She spotted him almost immediately, not because she recognized him, but because he was the only man standing with any kind of formal expectancy, apart from a thick-shouldered man in a good coat near the front of the crowd. The thick-shouldered man in the good coat was looking at her. She walked toward him. He didn't move to meet her. As she got closer, she saw his face change. It wasn't subtle. It was the kind of change that happens on a person's face when they open a package and find something entirely different from what they ordered. A flash of genuine surprise followed by something colder, something calculating. She stopped 6 feet from him. Mr. Kincaid. That's right. His eyes moved over her the way a man eyes a piece of furniture he's considering sending back. You're Naomi Mercer. I am. He looked at her for a moment that stretched longer than it had any right to. Someone nearby had already noticed the pause. A couple of merchants near the depot door were watching. You don't look like your letters suggested, Edgar said. Not quietly. Not with any effort to keep the conversation between them. Naomi kept her voice steady. I don't believe I made any promises about my appearance, Mr. Kincaid. No. His jaw tightened. I suppose the agency did that for you. He turned slightly, just enough to address the watching crowd, and that was when she understood this wasn't going to be a private conversation. That had never been his intention. "That is not the woman I sent money for." His voice carried like he was calling cattle. "Look at her. She's plain as a fence post and twice as worn." The laughter came fast. Not from everyone. She would remember that later, that it wasn't everyone. But enough. Enough to fill the space. Enough to bounce off the depot walls and land on her skin like something physical. Naomi didn't move. She was aware of her heart hammering. She was aware of her fingers tightening on the suitcase handle until the leather bit into her palm. She was aware of about 40 people watching her, waiting to see what she would do. She would not cry. She had decided that before she even fully understood what was happening, whatever came next, she would not give him that. "I'm sorry the arrangement doesn't suit you," she said. Her voice came out level. She was proud of that afterward. "I'll need the agency's return fee to get back to Cheyenne." Edgar's expression shifted from contempt to something even uglier, amusement. "You think I'm paying to send back something I didn't order?" The contract. The contract was for a woman the agency described as capable and presentable. "You're one of those things? Maybe." More laughter. Quieter this time. A few people in the crowd had stopped laughing and were watching with something closer to discomfort. Naomi looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the letter in her bag. "I am a man of my word." She thought about $12 in her coat pocket, all she had left after the train fare. She thought about the 600 miles of territory between herself and anywhere that might have a bed she could afford. "Then I'll find my own way," she said. She turned and walked back toward the depot bench, because there was nowhere else to walk to. She sat down. She put the suitcase between her feet. She stared at the middle distance and did not look at the crowd and did not let her face collapse, because that required every unit of concentration she possessed. She heard them dispersing slowly. She heard Edgar Kincaid's voice somewhere across the platform, already moving on, already making a joke of it to whoever was laughing with him. She opened her bag. She took out the bread even though she wasn't hungry. She ate it because it gave her hands something to do. She had $12. A train back to Cheyenne would cost her 8 of them. She would arrive with $4 and no position waiting for her and no letter of introduction. And 30 years old, and she would start again. Except that starting again at 30 was not the same as starting again at 20, and she had started again at 20, and it had nearly broken her then. She was still sitting there, working through the arithmetic of disaster, when she heard footsteps stop in front of her. She looked up. He was tall but not imposing, the kind of height that comes without any effort to take up space, the kind that just exists. Somewhere in his mid-30s, dark circles under his eyes that looked permanent, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in several days. His coat was clean but old, the kind of coat that had been good quality once and had since been worn honestly. Behind him, pressed against his legs on either side, were 2 small girls with identical dark braids and identical expressions of extreme wariness. They looked like children who had learned to be quiet around new people. The man looked at her for a moment. He didn't look at her the way Edgar had looked at her. He looked at her the way a person looks at someone who is sitting at the edge of a very difficult situation, and he seemed to be making some kind of calculation. "You're Miss Mercer," he said. It wasn't a question, but she answered it. "Yes. I'm Gideon Archer." He paused. "I have a ranch about 4 miles east." She waited. "I heard what Kincaid said." His voice dropped slightly. Not from embarrassment, more like he was being precise. "I've known Edgar Kincaid for 6 years. He is not a man I would have trusted with my daughters." Naomi looked at him. She wasn't sure what he was building toward. "These are my daughters," he said. "Ivy and June." He put a hand briefly on each girl's head in turn, a small, instinctive gesture. "Their mother passed a year and a half ago." "I'm sorry," Naomi said. He nodded. Then he said, "I wasn't planning to say this today. I wasn't planning to say it at all. But I've been watching my girls for 18 months and watching my ranch, and I'm—" He stopped. He seemed to be deciding something. "I need help," he said. "Practical help. Someone who can be reliable. Someone who won't be frightened off by hard winters and hard work." He looked at her steadily. "I don't have Kincaid's money. I can offer room, board, fair share of whatever the ranch earns, and—" Another pause. "And a proper arrangement, if that's what you need to make it legal. Marriage, I mean." Naomi stared at him. My girls don't need the prettiest woman, he said quietly. They need someone who stays. Behind him, the smaller of the two girls, she would learn later that was June, was watching Naomi with enormous dark eyes. Not suspicious exactly. Something more like hopeful, and trying very hard not to be hopeful, because hope had let her down before. Naomi looked at the $12 in the context of Cheyenne. She looked at the depot. She looked at this man with his worn coat and his honest exhaustion and his two small daughters pressed against his legs like small ships sheltering against a rock in a storm. You don't know anything about me, she said. I know you didn't fold in front of Edgar Kincaid on that platform, Gideon said. That tells me something. It might just tell you I'm too stubborn to collapse in public. That's still something. He said it without any irony at all. She looked at his daughters again. Ivy had shifted slightly from behind his leg and was studying Naomi with an expression of severe assessment entirely incongruous with a 7-year-old's face. What happened to your wife? Naomi asked. Something moved through his expression. Fever. Last February. It went through fast. He stopped. She was a good woman. I'm not trying to replace anyone, Naomi said. I'm not asking you to. He said it simply. I'm asking if you can be someone. For them. A pause. And for the ranch. I won't pretend the ranch isn't part of it. Naomi picked up her suitcase and held it in her lap. The bench beneath her was cold. The platform was mostly empty now, the crowd gone back to their marketing and their gossip. The train that had brought her here was already being switched around on the far end of the depot. By tomorrow morning, there would be a southbound departure. 8 of her $12. How bad is the ranch? She asked. He answered without hesitating. Bad enough that I need help. Not so bad it can't be brought back. He paused. I think. The I think was more honest than any confidence would have been. And what exactly would this arrangement look like? She asked. You'd have your own room. I'll not pretend this is something it's not. We'd be strangers sharing a house and a task. But I'd treat you with respect. You'd have say in the house and the girls' care. I'd make sure of that. He looked at the ground briefly and then back at her. It's not much of an offer. No, she agreed. It isn't. Silence. But it's honest, she said. I try to be. Naomi Mercer sat on a cold depot bench with $12 in her pocket and a suitcase that held everything she owned, and she looked at two small girls who had been standing in the cold for 10 minutes without complaining once, pressed against their father's legs, waiting. June was still watching her with those careful, hopeful eyes. Ivy had crossed her arms. Her expression said, We'll see about you. Something about that expression, the absolute refusal to be taken in by appearances or promises, struck Naomi somewhere deep and familiar. All right, she said. She stood up. Gideon looked slightly startled, as if he'd half expected a different answer even after making the offer. All right? Yes. She picked up her suitcase properly. But I'll need to know what the fences look like and where the water situation stands before I decide if that I think is close enough to certainty. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way, but it tried. Fair enough, he said. He reached down and took her suitcase from her hand without making a production of it, just picked it up with the practicality of someone who was used to carrying things. June slipped forward and took Naomi's free hand, suddenly, without warning, with the bold impulsiveness that belongs only to children who have decided something the moment they decide it. Ivy watched this and said nothing, but she uncrossed her arms. They walked across the depot together, the four of them, through the remainder of the crowd, past a group of men near the post office who turned to stare. One of them said something Naomi didn't fully catch, something that included the word leftover. She heard Gideon's jaw tighten beside her. She kept walking. The wagon was waiting behind the depot on the rutted side road. A good wagon, older, but well-maintained where it mattered. The horse looked tired but healthy. Naomi cataloged this automatically. A man who kept his horse healthy even when tired himself was a man with workable priorities. She climbed up to the bench. June scrambled up beside her immediately, like it had been decided. Ivy climbed up on Gideon's other side with studied dignity. Gideon clicked the horse forward. They left Blackstone Crossing behind them. Nobody came to wave them off. Naomi watched the town fall away behind her and didn't look back. She looked forward, at the road east, at the yellow grass and the white sky and the dark line of timber ridges against the October light. June, Gideon said quietly. She held my hand first, June said, which was not true. But she said it with such complete conviction that it became its own kind of truth. Ivy said nothing. She was watching Naomi from the far side of the bench with an expression that Naomi was beginning to read. Not unfriendly, not hostile, but deeply, seriously undecided. This was a child who would make up her own mind and not a moment before she was ready. Naomi respected that. The fence situation, she said to Gideon. Bad, he said. East Quarter especially. And water? Creek's reliable, 3 seasons. The 4th? He paused. We manage. Livestock? He gave her a sideways look. You know livestock? I grew up on a farm in Ohio until I was 18, she said. Then I spent 12 years managing not to starve in various other ways. Yes, I know livestock. He looked back at the road. 11 head of cattle, 4 of them winter week last season and 2 didn't make it through. I have 8 healthy sheep, a milk cow, 2 pigs, some chickens. The chickens are... He paused, searching for the word. Disorganized, June supplied. That's one word, Gideon said. Naomi looked at June. How disorganized? They go wherever they want, June said. Papa says bad words when he has to find them. I do not, Gideon said. You say consarnate, Ivy said from the far side without looking up. 6 times last Tuesday. There was a moment of silence. That's not a bad word, Gideon said. Mama used to count it, Ivy said quietly. The silence that followed was a different kind. Naomi looked at Gideon's profile. His jaw had gone still. She could see him absorbing the mention of his wife the way a person absorbs a small collision, felt, registered, then pushed through. She didn't try to fill the silence. Some silences were not hers to fill. After a while, the road curved east and the timber ridges came closer, and below them she could see the valley beginning to open, pasture land and fence lines, and, in the middle distance, a cluster of buildings that had to be the ranch. Even from here she could see the broken fence lines, the gap in the barn roof, the lean of the smaller outbuilding. Bad enough that I need help. Not so bad it can't be brought back. I think. She let out a slow breath. Ivy was watching her again, watching her look at the ranch. It needs work, Ivy said. It came out flat. Not an apology, not a challenge, just a fact stated plainly. Most things worth having do, Naomi said. Ivy looked at her for a moment. Something in the girl's expression shifted, so slightly it was almost invisible. She turned back to the road, but she had shifted 3 inches closer on the bench. The wagon rolled on. The ranch came closer. The October sky held its pale, enormous light over everything, indifferent and vast, the way frontier sky always is, pressing everything beneath it into proportion, making human-sized troubles look temporarily smaller against the scale of all that open land. Naomi Mercer, who had arrived that morning as someone else's rejected mistake, rode toward an uncertain future on a cold bench between a man she did not know and 2 children who had already lost too much. She gripped the edge of the bench and kept her balance. That was all she could do right now. That, and look at the broken fence line and begin, quietly, in the back of her mind, calculating where to start. When the wagon finally stopped in front of the house, the horse blew out a long breath as if it had been holding it for miles. Gideon set the brake and climbed down first. He lifted June down. She was already chattering about whether there was enough cornmeal left for Johnny cakes for supper, and turned to help Naomi with her suitcase. She was already on the ground, suitcase in hand, looking at the front of the house. It was a solid structure. That was the first thing she noticed. The bones were good. Someone had built this house to last. But it had gone unwatched for long enough that small problems had multiplied into larger ones. A split board above the door that had let water into the frame, a window on the east side with a cracked pane stuffed with rags, a porch step that would need replacing before it turned someone's ankle. She could see all of it, and she could see what it would have looked like before, when someone was tending to it. She could also see what it could look like again. Gideon came to stand beside her. I want to see the interior, she said, and then I want to see the barn. He studied her sideways. Most women would want to see their room first. I'm not most women, she said it without heat. Also rooms I can sleep in regardless. Barns I can't fix in the dark. She glanced at him. Which one's worse, the barn roof or the east fence? Depends on the week, he said. Inside, the house was cold in the specific way of houses where the fires hadn't been lit consistently, the cold that settles into walls and floorboards and won't leave until it's driven out by regular warmth and habitation. The kitchen was the best room because it had to be. A cast iron stove, a work table, shelves with provisions that were sparse but organized in the way of a man trying to keep control of something. The sitting room beyond it had 2 chairs and a braided rug that had seen better days, and a set of drawings tacked to the wall, clearly the girls, horses, and figures and shapes that might have been houses. They gave the room its only warmth. The girls' room, 2 small beds, a shared quilt, a wooden box each for belongings. Scrupulously equal in its arrangement, she could see that Gideon had been careful about fairness. Her room, bare. A bed frame with a straw mattress. A hook on the wall. A window with a view of the side yard and the tree line. It was a room that had been empty long enough to forget what it was for. "It'll do," she said. She turned around and went to look at the barn. The barn was going to be a project. The roof gap was significant. Not catastrophic, but any serious snow load would find it. The eastern stall needed new boards. The hay was low, which was the most pressing concern. They would need to acquire more before the season turned, and from the look of the sky and the feel of the air, the season intended to turn sooner rather than later. She walked every inch of it, not talking, just looking. Gideon followed her, saying nothing. He had the sense to let her look without filling the silence with justification. She appreciated that. The livestock were thin but not broken. The milk cow was the best kept of them, which told her something about where his priorities had gone when time ran short. Smart choice. The cow was the girl's protein. She came out of the barn and stood in the yard. The sun was going down behind the ridge. The air was sharp, carrying the first real teeth of coming cold. June had appeared from somewhere with a chicken under her arm, apparently having resolved whatever organizational crisis the chickens were involved in. Ivy stood near the porch, watching Naomi with her permanent expression of intensive evaluation. "What are you thinking?" Gideon asked. Naomi looked at the fence line, at the barn, at the house, at the 2 small girls and the tired man who had looked at a stranger on a train platform and made a decision that she still wasn't entirely sure she understood. "I'm thinking the east fence first," she said, "before we lose more livestock. Then the barn roof. That can't wait past first snow. Then the window. Then we need to talk about your hay situation, because what you have in there won't cover the winter." He was quiet for a moment. "You worked all that out in 20 minutes. I wasn't looking at anything complicated." Another pause. "Most people I've explained this place to—" He stopped. "What?" "They looked at what was wrong," he said. "You looked at what needed doing first." Naomi looked at him. "They're not different things." "They feel different," he said, "when you're the one who's been trying to carry it." She didn't have an answer for that. She understood it, the distinction between seen problems and seen work. But she wasn't sure anything she could say would be useful, so she said nothing. The chicken under June's arm made a noise of protest. "Can she cook?" June asked, looking up at her father. "I don't know yet," Gideon said. "I can cook," Naomi said. "Better than Papa?" June asked. "June," Gideon said. "Papa burns the eggs," June said confidentially to Naomi. "I don't always burn the eggs," Gideon said. "Tuesday," Ivy said from the porch. "And Thursday." "And Sunday," June added. "But Sunday we didn't say anything because you looked sad." The silence that followed that statement was very different from the silence in the wagon when Ivy had mentioned her mother. That had been grief. This was something else. The particular helplessness of a man who has been found out by people who love him too much to successfully protect his feelings. Naomi looked at her feet for a moment. "I can make supper," she said, "if you show me what you have." She followed June back in, and June showed her the provisions with the authority of a 7-year-old who had been keeping track of the family's groceries longer than she should have had to. And Naomi listened to every word and took stock of what there was. Behind her, here through this kitchen window, she could see Gideon standing in the yard in the failing light, looking at the barn roof. She turned back to the stove. She found the skillet. She found the cornmeal. She found 3 eggs that hadn't been burned yet. She lit the stove. It caught on the first try. Good cast iron, well-seasoned, whatever else had gone wrong in this house, someone had always taken care of the stove. And the warmth spread out from it into the cold kitchen, like something returning from a long absence. June pressed against her side, watching. "Are you going to stay?" June asked. Naomi looked down at her. Outside, the first wind of the evening was moving through the timber, and the light was going fast now, and somewhere in the dark beyond the window, the valley stretched out long and cold and indifferent, full of people who had already decided what they thought about the woman who had arrived on the morning train. "I said I would," Naomi said. June thought about this. Then she leaned against Naomi's arm the way a small animal leans against the closest warm thing it can find. "Okay," she said. Ivy, in the doorway, watched all of this with her arms crossed and her expression carefully neutral. She didn't lean. But she didn't leave either. And after a while, without quite seeming to decide to, she crossed the kitchen and sat at the table, pulled her knees up, and watched Naomi cook. The 3 eggs became supper for 4. Naomi stretched them with the cornmeal and the end of a potato, and something that had been dried herbs in a better season. It wasn't enough, and it wasn't elegant, and it tasted like what it was, plain food made from not enough. But it was hot, and the kitchen was warm now. And when Gideon came in from checking the livestock, he stopped in the doorway for just a moment, arrested by something she couldn't see. Then he sat down. They ate together, the 4 of them, at a table that had been set for 3 for a year and a half. Nobody said anything profound. June talked about the chicken. Gideon answered in single syllables. Ivy ate methodically and watched Naomi when she thought Naomi wasn't looking. After supper, Naomi washed the dishes. When she turned around, Ivy was standing behind her with a dish rag in her hand. "I dry," Ivy said, flat, definitive. "All right," Naomi said. They stood at the wash basin together in the lamplight, Naomi washing, Ivy drying, and neither of them said anything at all. But when Naomi handed Ivy the last plate, Ivy's fingers wrapped around it properly, deliberately, and she dried it in careful circles and set it on the shelf with a precision that was almost ceremonial. Then she went to bed without a word. Naomi stood alone in the kitchen. The lamp was burning low. The stove was settling into its nighttime sounds. Through the wall, she could hear Gideon's footsteps, slow, heavy with fatigue, moving down the hall to his own room. She sat down at the kitchen table. She spread her hands flat on the surface of it, scarred pine, worn smooth with years of use. And she sat there in the quiet and let herself feel all the things she had not allowed herself to feel since that morning on the depot platform. The humiliation, the terror of the $12, the strangeness of this place, and this arrangement and these 2 children and this man she didn't know. She felt all of it, let it move through her, and then she pressed her palms down firmly on the table. "All right," she told herself, "all right. Here's what you have. You have a roof, you have work you understand, you have 2 small girls who are not going to make anything easy. And that is fine, because easy was never what you were built for." She listened to the timber creak in the night wind. She went to bed. She stared at the ceiling of the bare room in the darkness for a long time. Then she slept. She woke before dawn to the sound of the wind changing. Not the steady timber creak of the night before. Something different. A shift in direction, coming from the northwest now, carrying a bite that didn't belong to early October. Naomi lay still for a moment, listening to it work its way under the eaves, and then she got up because the cold in the room told her the stove had gone out overnight, and that was a problem she could fix. She dressed in the dark, found her way to the kitchen by memory because she'd already mapped it once, and that was usually enough. The stove was stone cold. The fire had died sometime before midnight. She rebuilt it from the ash box up, the way her father had taught her, tearing small pieces and feeding the flame carefully before adding anything substantial. It caught. She was glad. She didn't want the first morning to start with cold hands and no breakfast. By the time the light came through the east window, gray and tentative, she had the stove hot, water heating, and a pan of cornmeal porridge working on the back burner. She didn't know yet what the family's morning routines were, but she knew that children needed to eat before they could do anything else, and that men doing heavy labor ran better on a full stomach than an empty one, and that was enough to start with. She heard small feet on the floorboards before she heard anything else. June appeared in the kitchen doorway, her dark braids half undone from sleep, wearing a flannel nightgown that was slightly too short and a pair of wool socks that had been mended so many times in different colors they looked like something intentional. She stopped when she saw Naomi at the stove, just for a second, a flicker of surprise. as if she'd expected to come into a cold kitchen, had been prepared for a cold kitchen, and now didn't quite know what to do with the alternative. "You made a fire," June said. "Stove was out," Naomi said. "Papa usually makes it, but sometimes he's already outside and then we wait." "How long do you wait?" June thought about it. "Until it gets too cold." Naomi stirred the porridge. "Well, you won't need to wait this morning." June padded across the kitchen floor in her mismatched socks and climbed onto the bench at the table and sat there watching Naomi work with the patient. Total attention that children bring to things they find genuinely interesting. Naomi didn't speak to fill the quiet. Neither did June. After a while, June said, "Ivy's still sleeping. Let her. She doesn't sleep late usually. She just doesn't want to come out yet." Naomi glanced at her. "Why not?" June considered the question with more seriousness than it perhaps warranted. "She's deciding," she said finally. "About what?" "About you." June said it completely without apology. "Ivy has to decide about things before she can be around them. She decided about the new rooster for 4 days before she named him. And then what happened? She named him Gerald, and now he sleeps outside her window, and she talks to him sometimes." June paused. "She'll decide about you faster than Gerald, I think. You're more useful than a rooster." Naomi kept her expression level. "That's good to know." Gideon came in from outside while she was portioning the porridge into bowls. He stomped mud from his boots at the door. Already had been out to check the livestock. She could tell from the cold that came in with him and the fresh hay stuck to his coat sleeve. He stopped when he saw the table set. He looked at the bowls. He looked at her. He had the same expression June had worn, slightly recalibrated for a grown man who thought he was better at hiding it. "You didn't need to do that," he said. "I was up anyway." "Still." He hung his coat, sat down. "I usually make porridge." "I know. June told me." He glanced at June. June was examining her mended socks. He looked back at Naomi. "I burn that too," he said, with a flatness that might have been self-deprecating humor. "The eggs, I believe," Naomi said. "Porridge takes a different kind of patience." "What kind?" "You have to watch it the whole time and not go do something else." "Ah," he said, which was clearly an acknowledgement that this was where his porridge went wrong. Ivy appeared in the doorway. Fully dressed, braids neat, expression composed. She surveyed the kitchen with the systematic thoroughness of a senior officer conducting inspection, her eyes moving from Naomi to her father to the bowls on the table and back to Naomi. "Good morning," Naomi said. "Morning," Ivy said. A beat. "The porridge smells different. I added a pinch of something from the jar on the second shelf. I hope that was all right." Ivy crossed to the shelf and examined it. "That's cinnamon. Mama kept it for special." The kitchen went very quiet. Naomi set down the spoon. "I'm sorry. I should have asked before using it." Ivy stood with her hand near the jar for a moment. Her back was to the room. Nobody spoke. Then Ivy turned around and sat at the table and picked up her spoon. "It smells good," she said. Not warmly, not forgivingly, just factually, as though she had weighed the infraction against the result and rendered a careful verdict. Gideon exhaled very slowly through his nose. They ate breakfast. The work that followed was the kind that doesn't look like anything from the outside, the 1,000 small tasks that hold a failing place together through sheer stubbornness. Naomi had already seen the priority list in her head when she went to sleep the night before, and she started working it from the top without fanfare. The split board above the door took most of the morning. She found the lumber pile behind the barn, not much left but enough for this, and the tools in the lean-to were decent quality even if they'd been sitting unused long enough to need oiling. She oiled them. Then she pried out the split board with the careful hand, the way you had to when the surrounding wood was good and worth preserving, and cut a new one and fitted it and sealed it with the pitch she found stored in the back of the barn. Gideon came by around mid-morning on his way between the pasture fence and the barn. He stopped when he saw what she was doing. "You know joinery?" he asked. "I know enough to keep water out of a frame." She tested the new board. "Good. Water damage is the thing that takes a house down. Everything else you can deal with, but once water gets into the frame, you're fighting rot for years." He was quiet for a moment. "I knew about the board. I'm not saying you didn't. I just kept thinking I'd get to it." "I know." She climbed down. There's a window on the east side with a cracked pane. The rag stuffed in it will hold for now, but it needs replacing before heavy snow. Glass has to come from town. I know. I'm just telling you so we can plan for it. He looked at her steadily. You make a lot of lists in your head, don't you? Is that a problem? No. He considered. No, I don't think it is. He picked up the tools she'd been using and carried them back to the lean-to without being asked. The girls were around the place through the day, June constantly in motion, bringing things and asking questions and offering commentary on the ongoing state of the chickens, who had indeed scattered in 4 directions overnight and were engaged in some kind of territorial dispute near the water trough. Ivy was harder to locate. She moved quietly and turned up in unexpected places. On the porch reading, behind the barn with Gerald the rooster, in the kitchen doorway watching Naomi without any particular attempt at concealment. Naomi let her watch. She'd earned it. In the afternoon, she went through the root cellar and the full pantry inventory, which told a story she'd been expecting but had hoped to be wrong about. Provisions were lean. Not desperate yet. They had enough to get through October comfortably. But if November came early and hard, the margin disappeared fast. The hay situation was worse than the food. What was stored in the barn would not last a full winter, not with the number of animals they were keeping. She found Gideon repairing the east fence. She could see from 50 yards that this fence had been repaired before, repeatedly, at different times. Small fixes laid over each other like patches on a coat that eventually becomes more patch than coat. He was working steadily, jaw set, the look of a man who has been winning a small war of attrition for a long time. She came up beside him and worked the next section without asking. He glanced at her. Can you get hay from somewhere before the prices go up with the cold? She asked. Henderson sometimes sells surplus. He's 4 miles north. Could you reach him this week? If I finish this section? He worked a staple through the wire. You find something in the cellar? You're short, not catastrophically, but if you have a bad month on top of short, it gets hard. He set down the pliers, looked at the fence line stretching ahead of them, 100 yards still to do. Easy. I know, he said. I'm not telling you that to tell you what you already know, she said. I'm trying to figure out if there's something I can do to cover labor here so you have time to make that trip to Henderson. He looked at her sideways. You want to finish the fence? I can finish one section of fence. She tested the wires she'd just worked. What I can't do is make a deal with Henderson for you. He doesn't know me. Something passed across his face. Not quite gratitude, too complicated for that. More like the look of a person who has been alone with a problem long enough that having someone acknowledge it feels almost foreign. All right, he said. He went to find Henderson the next morning. Left before light. She was already up and the stove was already going. She spent the morning on the fence. It was harder alone. Working wire requires 2 hands for tension and a third for the staple gun, and she didn't have 3 hands, so she improvised with a post and a piece of salvaged rope as a makeshift anchor. It was slower and less elegant than it would have been with help, but it worked, and she finished the section before the light turned toward noon. Then she came back and made lunch and helped June chase 3 chickens out of the vegetable garden plot, where they had no business being. Gerald doesn't go in the garden, June said, slightly breathless. I think he tells the others not to, but they don't listen. What does Ivy think of Gerald's leadership abilities? June considered this seriously. She says he's doing his best. High praise, Naomi said. That's what I thought too, June agreed. By the time Gideon came back from Henderson's that evening, 6 bales of hay agreed on, to be delivered by the week's end at a fair price. The fence was done, the chicken situation had been resolved to a partial degree, and supper was on the stove. He came in, checked the fence section as he passed, said nothing until he was through the door, and then said, You did the whole section. Told you I would. I didn't quite believe it. He pulled off his coat. Henderson says hello, by the way. He wanted to know who was running the fence repairs on my property. I told him He paused. A beat. The word arrangement wasn't quite right. The word wife was technically accurate but sat oddly in the mouth of someone who'd only said it once, briefly, at a train depot 4 days ago. I told him someone had come to help manage the place. That's accurate, Naomi said. He washed his hands at the basin. He said whoever it was had a good eye for fence tension. Tell him I said thank you. Gideon looked at her. He's going to want to meet you, Henderson's wife, too. The valley knows things fast. I know. She stirred the pot. I expect the valley already knows several things about me. He was quiet for a moment. She could tell he was deciding how honest to be. Edgar's been talking, he said. I assumed. It's not kind, what he's saying. I assumed that too. She didn't look up from the pot. What is he saying? That I took his reject because I couldn't afford better. That you came here because no one else would have you. That the ranch is... He stopped. Desperate enough to take in strays, she said. Something like that. She stirred the pot. The steam rose. She thought about the $12 and the train south, and Edgar Kincaid's pointing finger and the laughter that had moved across the platform like a wave. Is any of that bothering you? She asked. I'm asking if it's bothering you. I asked first. Gideon sat down heavily at the table. He rubbed the back of his neck. It bothers me that he gets to keep talking, he said. I can take what people say about me. I've been taking it for a year, but... He stopped. But not about the girls, she said. He looked up. He said things about the girls. Not a question. The look on his face said he already knew. People sometimes say that a man struggling is a man who can't care for his children properly. I've heard that story before. She turned the heat down under the pot. Edgar is telling a story where you're the failure and I'm the proof. It's useful to him because it makes his rejection of me look like sense rather than cruelty. Gideon's jaw tightened. If he says anything in front of the girls, if he does, we deal with it. She sat across from him. Gideon. I'm not going to pretend his behavior doesn't matter, but the only thing that actually defeats the story he's telling is making this ranch into something nobody can argue with. That's a longer game than fighting him in town. He looked at her for a long moment. You've dealt with people like him before, he said. I've dealt with the version of this that happens to a woman on her own. She folded her hands on the table. The story is always the same. Someone with more power decides you are less than you are, and then they tell other people, and then you either collapse or you don't. And if you don't collapse, eventually the story changes because the facts change. The kitchen was warm. The stove was good and steady. Outside the window, the last light was dying behind the ridge and the wind had dropped, which meant the temperature was dropping with it. You don't think much of waiting to be vindicated, do you? He said. I think it takes too long, she said. I'd rather build something. He almost smiled again. The same one as before, didn't quite make it the whole way. I should tell you something, he said. She waited. When I made that offer at the depot, he said slowly, I wasn't entirely... I don't want you thinking I had a plan. I didn't have a plan. I saw what happened with Edgar, and I saw you sitting on that bench, and I just... He stopped. It was an impulse. I want you to know that. I know, she said. I'm saying I might not have fully thought through what I was asking you to take on. You told me it was bad enough to need help and not so bad it couldn't come back, she said. That was honest. That's enough. There's things about the valley you don't know yet, he said. Tell me. He looked at his hands. Edgar has friends here. People who do business with him. The Caldwell brothers. They run the mill. He's tied up with them on a timber contract. Martha Greer at the dry goods store. She's friendly with Edgar's sister. People who aren't against us exactly, but who are going to... He chose the word carefully. Positioned. Positioned against me. Against the idea of you. He looked up. I want you to be ready for it not to be easy. When has it been easy, she said, and she didn't mean it as a complaint, just a statement of fact. The way the sky was gray in October, or the wind came from the northwest. He looked at her. What happened to your wife? She asked. You told me at the depot it was fast, but how did the ranch get to where it is? Was it already struggling before? He didn't answer immediately. She could see him deciding what he wanted to say and what he wanted to keep. Clara was... He started again. She was the one who could talk to people. She knew everybody in the valley, knew what they needed, knew how to make them feel. He searched for the word. Comfortable. She did that. I do the land work, she did the people work, and between us we managed. He paused. When she died, I didn't know how to do either one without her because I'd never had to. And the girls they were 6 and their mother had just... He stopped. I lost a season. I lost it. The ranch almost went under in the spring. I pulled it back, but I was too late to plant properly, and the summer was hard, and by fall we were where you saw. Naomi was quiet. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me, he said. I know you're not. I'm telling you because I want to be honest about what happened. It wasn't just bad luck. I stopped for a while and things went wrong while I was stopped. You're not stopped now, she said. He looked at her. No, he said. I'm not. Ivy appeared in the kitchen doorway. She had a book under her arm and she looked between the two adults at the table with her usual forensic attentiveness. Is supper ready? She asked. Nearly, Naomi said. She stood and went back to the stove. Ivy came in and sat at the table across from her father. She put the book on the table but didn't open it. She watched Naomi's back for a moment. You fixed the top board, she said, above the door. This morning. It's been like that for a while. I know. Papa was going to fix it. I know he was. Naomi didn't turn around. He had a lot of fence to do. A pause. It's level, Ivy said. The new board. I checked. Naomi stirred the pot. Good. I tried for level. June burst through the back door trailing cold air and something that smelled strongly of the barnyard. Both Gideon and Ivy looked at her with the expression that her entrances apparently reliably produced. Gerald got into the barn again, June announced. How? Gideon said. The loose board on the south side. I've closed that board 3 times. Gerald finds them, June said. He's very determined. We'll deal with it tomorrow, Gideon said. I already moved him out, June said. She was already washing her hands at the basin with the efficiency of someone who washed barnyard off herself multiple times daily. I told him he wasn't supposed to be in there, and he looked at me very seriously. And then what? Naomi asked. And then he walked away. I think he understood. Or he's biding his time, Naomi said. June thought about this gravely. That's possible, she agreed. Gerald is strategic. Gideon put his hand over his mouth and looked at the ceiling. They ate. The stew was better than last night. She'd had more to work with, and time. June ate with the focused efficiency of a child who'd been hungry before and wasn't going to take food for granted. Ivy ate carefully, in the way of someone who had made table manners a private discipline. After supper, while Naomi was clearing, Ivy stayed at the table with her book. She read in silence. Then, without looking up, the river path down to the lower pasture, she said. There's a section where the bank undercut. You can't see it until you're already on it. Naomi looked at her. So, thank you for telling me. Ivy turned a page. You'd probably figure it out yourself. I just thought you should know. It was the most Ivy had said to her unprompted since she'd arrived. Naomi went back to washing dishes. She added the riverbank to her mental map. The days that followed had a rhythm to them, not smooth or regular. A ranch in difficult condition doesn't permit smooth rhythms, but a movement. Naomi was up first every morning, stove lit, porridge made or eggs scrambled, or, on the 2 occasions she managed to get to the root cellar before the girls were awake, a pot of something with dried beans that required no special ingenuity but held everyone together through the cold afternoons. Gideon worked from before light until dark, and she worked alongside him where she could and separately where she was more useful separately, and they communicated mostly in practical exchanges that were honest and without waste. It was not a bad way to work with someone. The first test came from the valley, not from the weather. Martha Greer owned the dry goods store in Blackstone Crossing, and she was not an unkind woman exactly, but she was a careful one. Careful about who she extended credit to, careful about who she was seen associating with, careful about whose stories she chose to repeat, and whose she chose to let lie. When Naomi came into the store 10 days after arriving with a short shopping list and 12 cents she'd found in the kitchen jar that Gideon had told her she could use, Martha looked at her over the counter with an expression calibrated to be polite while communicating everything necessary. Miss Mercer, she said. Mrs. Greer. Naomi set the list on the counter. Martha looked at the list. Archer's account is a bit... She paused, picked her words. Extended at the moment. I know. I'm paying for this with cash. Martha's eyebrows moved. 12 cents worth. Yes. A pause. Well, Martha reached for the items. She moved with a slight deliberateness, the way people move when they want you to know they're doing you a small favor. I heard you've been settling in at the Archer place. That's right. It must be quite different from... Martha turned to the shelf. Where did you come from? Cheyenne, was it? Yes. Quite different from Cheyenne. Some things are different, Naomi said. Some things are the same. Martha set the items on the counter. Edgar Kincaid's a good customer of mine, she said. It was entirely conversational. Good family, I'm sure. It was a shame what happened at the depot. These arrangements sometimes don't work out the way people plan. Naomi looked at her steadily. Which arrangement are you referring to? Martha blinked. Well, the original one. The one where Mr. Kincaid received a woman who traveled 600 miles to honor a contract he then publicly refused? Naomi's voice was even. Yes, that was a shame. The temperature in the store shifted by several degrees. I know what you meant, Mrs. Greer. Naomi put 12 cents on the counter, picked up her items. Thank you. She walked out. Her hands were steady. Her heart was not particularly, but hands were what showed. She was halfway back to the wagon when she heard footsteps behind her. Miss Mercer. She turned. It was a woman she didn't recognize, closer to her own age, solid-framed, with wind-reddened cheeks and an expression that was not Martha Greer's carefully calibrated neutrality. This was the expression of someone who had seen what just happened and made a fast decision. I'm Ruth Calloway, the woman said. My husband Tom has the spread 2 miles south of Archer's. I saw you in the store just now. She paused. Martha Greer has been Edgar Kincaid's mouthpiece for 20 years. Don't take it personal. I try not to. Ruth Calloway looked at her, a direct, assessing look, not unlike Ivy's, but warmer. What Kincaid did at the depot was a filthy piece of work, she said. Not everyone in this valley thinks the way he does. I want you to know that. Naomi looked at her. Thank you. How's the ranch? Working? Gideon doing all right? He's working hard. Ruth nodded. Something in her expression relaxed slightly, as if she'd been carrying a concern about Gideon and had just gotten partial reassurance. Those girls, she said, Ivy and June, they doing better? Yes? Last winter. Ruth stopped. Last winter was hard. For all of them. She squared her shoulders. If you need anything, someone to talk to, or if there's something the ranch needs and you're not sure where to find it, you can come to us. She paused. Tom said the same when I told him I was going to say it, so it's from both of us. Naomi held on to the package in her arms. I appreciate that. Gideon's a good man, Ruth said. He just got... She searched for the right word. Swamped, she said. And nobody helped him enough when Clara died. I felt bad about that. He's not swamped now, Naomi said. Ruth smiled. It was a sudden, genuine thing that changed her whole face. Good, she said. That's good to hear. She turned and went back toward the hardware store. Naomi watched her go. Then she climbed into the wagon and sat there for a moment. One Martha Greer, one Ruth Calloway. That was the valley. The same way every place was, some of one kind and some of another, and the question was always which kind there were more of and which kind were louder. She started the horse and headed back east. She was a mile from town when she heard hooves coming up behind her, fast, the way people ride when they're trying to catch someone rather than when they're simply in a hurry. She didn't pull over immediately. She kept her pace and watched the road ahead. The rider came alongside her, Edgar Kincaid. He had a good horse, well kept, which she noticed the way she noticed everything practical. He was dressed well, not for work, but for being seen. His face wore an expression of affable reasonableness that she suspected was more calculated than it looked. Miss Mercer, he said, surprised to see you still in the valley. She didn't slow the wagon. Mr. Kincaid, I heard you've been setting yourself up at Archer's place. He rode easily beside her, matching her pace without effort. Must be challenging. Is there something you want? She asked. He seemed mildly amused by the directness. I thought we might talk, like adults. I'm driving. I see that. He adjusted his horse slightly. I wanted to say, what happened at the depot was perhaps more public than it needed to be. She looked at him briefly. It was exactly as public as you chose to make it. He wasn't embarrassed by this. She noticed that. He acknowledged it with the small shrug of someone who didn't consider it a significant problem. Emotions run high, he said. The agency had set certain expectations, and you were... He paused. Not what I expected. You paid to humiliate someone in front of 40 people, and now you'd like me to accept an apology that doesn't quite have the word sorry in it, she said. Is that what's happening? He looked at her with something that might have been appreciation or might have been the expression a man wears when he's recalibrating his approach. You're sharper than you look, he said. Most people are, she said, when you don't bother looking carefully. He rode alongside her for another 100 yards in silence. Gideon Archer is a good man, he said finally, but that ranch is going under. I've watched it for 2 years. He doesn't have the capital to get it back to where it needs to be. The hay, the fences, the repairs. He can't keep up. Funny, she said. He seems to be keeping up fine. For now. For now is how ranches work, Mr. Kincaid. You do today's work today. He can't give you what a woman in your position deserves, Edgar said. The reasonableness in his voice had shifted slightly. There was something else under it now, something Naomi was trying to identify. I made a hasty decision at the depot. I'm acknowledging that. And I'm saying that if you were willing to reconsider the original arrangement. She pulled the wagon to a stop. She turned and looked at him. He stopped his horse. She held his gaze for a moment, long enough that it became slightly uncomfortable for him. She could tell from the way he shifted in the saddle. You rejected me publicly in front of half your town, she said. You called me plain. You laughed at me. You let other people laugh at me. You sent me away with nothing. She kept her voice very level. And now you'd like to reconsider. I'm saying, I heard what you said. She picked up the reins. I'm also going to tell you something, Mr. Kincaid, so we're clear about where we stand. I came to Blackstone Valley to build something. I'm building it. Whatever you said about me on that platform, and whatever you've said since, none of it changes the fence I fixed yesterday, or the hay Gideon secured from Henderson, or the breakfast those girls ate this morning. She looked at him steadily. The story you've been telling about me runs in one direction. The work I'm doing runs in another. Give it time and see which one people remember. She clicked the horse forward. Edgar Kincaid sat on his horse in the road and watched her go. She didn't look back. Her hands on the reins were absolutely steady. She didn't let them shake until she was around the bend and out of his sight, and then she gripped the leather tight and breathed through it, and after a minute or so, she was all right again. The ridge came up ahead of her. Beyond it, east, the Archer Ranch. The fence was fixed. The hay was coming. The stove was good. She kept going. The Henderson hay arrived on a Thursday. 6 bales on a flatbed wagon, driven by a boy of about 15 who introduced himself as Henderson's youngest, and who stared at Naomi with undisguised curiosity the entire time he helped stack the bales in the barn. She didn't comment on it. People were going to look. Let them look and form their own conclusions from what they actually saw, rather than what Edgar Kincaid told them to see. Gideon paid Henderson's boy with cash he'd pulled from a locked tin in the back of the kitchen shelf. Money that had clearly been saved against exactly this kind of necessity, set aside in small amounts over a long time. He counted it carefully, got the right amount, not a cent more. The boy left. Gideon stood looking at the hay in the barn with the expression of a man who has resolved one problem and is already thinking about the next 3. It'll get us through November, Naomi said from behind him. Barely. November is the month we need. After that, we can see about January. He turned. You think like a farmer. I grew up as one. Not like a laundress, he said. Not unkindly, just noting it. A laundress is what I did for money, she said. A farm is what I knew before that. He nodded. He didn't push further. She appreciated that about him. He took information as it came and didn't dig for more than was offered. It was a reasonable way to be with a person you were still learning. October deepened into itself. The mornings came harder now, frost on the window glass when the fire had gone low in the night, which meant she was getting up earlier to make sure it didn't. The girls needed the warmth by morning, and she'd decided that without making a production of it, just absorbed it as a fact and adjusted accordingly. June had started meeting her in the kitchen before the others were up. Not every morning, but most. She'd sit on the bench with her feet tucked under her and watch Naomi work and talk in the meandering, associative way of children whose minds move faster than their ability to organize the output. Naomi listened. She was good at listening. It was a skill she'd developed over years of being in rooms where other people's words were more welcome than her own. And she had learned to hear what was underneath what was said as well as what was said directly. June talked about her mother sometimes, not in a grief-forward way, More the way people mention someone who was important and is now simply absent, the way you reference a landmark that's no longer standing. Mama used to put the butter on the second shelf. Mama let us stay up late on Saturdays. Small domestic facts that had been important once and had nowhere to live now except in conversation. Naomi listened to each one. She didn't try to step into the space the facts described. She just acknowledged them and let them be what they were. One morning, June said, "Do you think she would have liked you?" Naomi was cracking eggs. She held that question for a moment before she answered. "I don't know," she said. "I never met her, but from what you've told me, she sounds like someone who cared about practical things getting done. So I hope she would have." June considered this. "She was good at things," she said. "She was good at..." Pause. "She was good at making things feel okay even when they weren't." "That's a real skill," Naomi said. "Can you do that?" Naomi set the eggs in the pan. "I'm better at making things actually okay," she said. "Which is a different thing. Sometimes it's slower, but it tends to last longer." June turned this over in her mind. "Like the fence," she said finally. "What about it?" "You fixed it for real instead of patching it again. Papa patches it, and it breaks again. You fixed it different." "The post was rotten at the base," Naomi said. "Patching the wire doesn't help if the post is rotten." "That's what I mean," June said, with the satisfaction of someone who has successfully made their point. The trouble with Edgar didn't disappear after the road encounter. She hadn't expected it to. People like Edgar Kincaid didn't recalculate and retreat. They repositioned. She could feel it in the small interactions in town, the slight pause before a greeting, the conversations that stopped just before she got close enough to join them. Not universal. Ruth Calloway was as good as her word, warm and direct every time their paths crossed. And there were others, the Morrissey family from the north end of the valley, old Walt Schaefer, who ran the feed store and had apparently decided he liked Naomi because she knew the difference between Timothy and alfalfa without being told. But Edgar had relationships in this valley that went back further than Naomi's arrival, and those relationships had weight. The specific form his repositioning took became clear on a Friday in late October, when Gideon came back from town with a set of his jaw that she'd learned to read as controlled anger. He didn't say anything until supper was done and the girls were in bed. Then he sat at the kitchen table and said, "Caldwell at the mill is pulling my lumber account." She sat down across from him. "Why?" "He says it's about payment terms. But Edgar is his partner on 2 timber contracts." He pressed his palms flat on the table. "Caldwell's been doing my lumber account for 4 years. Payment terms have never been a problem." "How much do you owe him currently?" $12, which I have." "Then pay it off and move to Harrigan's mill. Harrigan charges 10% more." "Is Harrigan tied to Kincaid?" "Not as far as I know." "Then pay the 10% and don't give Edgar another lever." She looked at him steadily. "What he's doing is trying to squeeze you on resources so that when the ranch struggles again, he has a reason to step in." Gideon looked at her. "Step in how?" She held his gaze. "He talked to me on the road," she said, "after I left Greer's store. I didn't tell you because it didn't seem urgent at the time. He offered to reconsider the original arrangement." The temperature in the kitchen dropped by several degrees that had nothing to do with the weather. "He what?" Gideon said. "He suggested that if I were willing to end the arrangement with you and return to the original plan, he'd be open to it." Gideon was very still. "I told him no," she said, clearly and without much room for interpretation. "He approached you on the road." He said it slowly, working through the fact. He's trying to solve a problem," Naomi said. "We're the problem, or rather, the fact that I'm here and the ranch is functioning is the problem, because it contradicts the story he told at the depot. If I were gone, his story would be correct again." Gideon stood up. He went to the window and stood with his back to her for a long moment. She could see his shoulders working through something. "If he says one word to you again," he started. "Gideon." She waited until he turned around. "I can handle Edgar Kincaid. What I need from you is to keep this ranch working, because that is the only argument that matters. Every acre that produces, every animal we keep through winter, every fence that holds, that's the argument." She paused. "Can you move your lumber account to Harrigan?" A long moment. "Yes," he said. "Then do it Monday." He sat back down. He looked at the table. "I'm sorry," he said, "that you have to..." "Don't apologize for him," she said. It's not yours to apologize for. He was quiet for a moment. Clara used to say I was bad at asking for help, he said. That I'd rather suffer a thing than admit I needed someone to carry part of it. Was she right? Probably. He looked up. I'm working on it. I noticed, she said. You've gotten better. Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. That's the first time you've said anything that wasn't about the ranch, he said. Don't read too much into it, she said. I'm going to bed. But she was aware, walking down the hall to her room, that she'd meant it. The first hard snow came on the second day of November, and it came without the gradual buildup that usually preceded it. No early flurries, no warning week of lowering skies. It came overnight, 6 inches by morning, and the sky was still putting down more when she rose to light the stove. She stood at the kitchen window and looked at the yard buried under white, and felt the particular quality of cold that settles in when snow stays rather than melts. And she knew without needing to be told that this was going to be a serious winter. Gideon was already in the barn. She could see the light through the gap under the barn door. She pulled on her coat and boots and went out. He was checking the animals, working methodically from one to the next, the way he did when he was managing worry rather than feeling it. She took the far side of the barn without discussion. The cattle were restless, not panicked. They'd seen snow before, but unsettled by the speed of it. 2 of the thinner ones from last season were already positioned near the back wall where the draft was least. Those 2 need extra hay today, she said. I know. And we should check the water trough before it freezes solid. Once it freezes over, it takes twice the effort to clear. Already on my list. She looked at the roof gap. The snow had packed in the open space but hadn't penetrated yet. The angle was keeping it out for now, but a significant load or a wind shift would change that. The roof, she said. I know, he said, with a flatness that told her he'd been looking at it since he came in. Can it wait? Day, maybe 2. Then today we prioritize the trough and the thin cattle and getting the spare board somewhere accessible, and tomorrow, if it's stopped, we get to the roof. If it's stopped. If it hasn't stopped, we do the roof anyway. He looked at her across the back of one of the cattle. An active snow. You'd rather do it after the weight builds? He didn't answer because that was its own answer. The snow continued through the day. By afternoon it was 8 inches and still going, and the wind had picked up from the northwest, which meant drifting, which meant the areas around the barn doors were going to be a problem by nightfall. She sent the girls to stay inside with instructions to keep the stove fed and to stay warm, instructions. June accepted with enthusiasm, and Ivy accepted with the expression of someone who understood the logic but found voluntary inactivity nearly physically painful. Before she went back out, Naomi showed Ivy how to manage the stove damper to keep the heat consistent without burning through wood too fast. Ivy watched with intense attention. How do you know that? She asked. Experience, Naomi said. How much experience? Years of it. Ivy looked at the damper. What if it gets too cold in here? You add wood. What if it gets too hot? Ivy thought. Close the damper more? Close it a quarter turn. You don't want to cut it completely or the smoke backs up. What if it backs up? Open every window and wake me up. Ivy nodded. She had the expression she wore when she was committing something to memory with full seriousness. The same expression she brought to her reading, to watching repairs being done, to observing anything she considered worth understanding. Ivy, Naomi said. The girl looked at her. You won't need to wake me up, but if you do, you do. Don't wait too long trying to manage it yourself. Something in Ivy's expression shifted, slightly, barely visible. Okay, she said. Outside, the cold was serious. Not life-threatening if you were dressed and moving, but the kind that worked its way through layers quickly. If you stood still, and she didn't stand still. She and Gideon cleared the barn door approach, checked the fence lines for the sections most likely to take damage from drifting and weight, brought the 2 thinnest cattle in closer, and reinforced the haystack with boards to keep it from being compressed and spoiled under the load. By the time the light started to fail, she was exhausted in the specific way of cold outdoor labor, the kind that goes into the bones and stays there until you've been warm for an hour. She and Gideon came in at the same time, both moving slowly, both past the point of conversation. Ivy had kept the stove steady. The house was warm. June had set the table for supper without being asked, and had also apparently reorganized the entire lower shelf of the pantry, which she announced proudly. "It was chaos," June said. "I fixed it." "It wasn't chaos," Gideon said, pulling off his boots. "It was hard to find things," June said diplomatically. They ate. Nobody talked much. Even June was quieter than usual, as though the weight of the snow outside had pressed some of the motion out of the room. Gideon ate with the focused efficiency of someone replacing fuel rather than enjoying a meal. Naomi looked across the table at him. The circles under his eyes had deepened over the past weeks, not from carelessness, but from accumulation, the kind of tired that doesn't fully lift even after sleep because there's always another thing waiting on the other side of rest. After supper, she made tea, which was not something she'd done before. She set a cup in front of him without comment. He looked at it. He looked at her. "I found it in the back of the shelf," she said. "Behind the cornmeal." He wrapped his hands around the cup. "Clara's," he said quietly. "I know. I figured she'd want it used." He was still for a moment. Then he drank it. The snow stopped in the early hours of the morning. She could tell by the quality of the silence when she woke, the different kind of quiet that comes when the world stops moving. 6 inches had become nearly a foot on the flat ground, more in the drifts. The ridge above the valley had disappeared under white. The barn roof was the first thing. She was out there before Gideon with the boards she'd staged the day before, already measuring the gap when he appeared carrying the pitch bucket. "I thought you might sleep in," he said. "The roof," she said. "I know," he said. Working together, with the cold around them and the snow still heavy on everything that would hold it, they sealed the gap in the barn roof properly. Not a patch this time, but a real repair. New boards fitted close and sealed at the seams and waited until the pitch set. It took 3 hours and her hands were numb through the work gloves by the time they were done, but when she climbed down and stood in the barn and looked up, no sky showed through. "That'll hold," Gideon said. "Yes," she said. They stood there for a moment in the barn's relative warmth. "Thank you," he said. Not for the roof specifically, she could tell it was larger than that. "Don't thank me," she said. "We're not done. We've got 2 months of winter ahead." "I know." He paused. He stopped. Started again. "I'd forgotten what it was like to have someone working the same problem." She looked at him. His face in the barn's dim light was honest in the way faces get, when people are too tired for anything else. "It helps," she said. Simple. True. "Yes," he said. "It does." They went inside. By the second week of November, the valley had organized itself around the snow in the way frontier communities do. Not gracefully, not without friction, but functionally. The families that had planned well were managing. The ones that hadn't were beginning to feel the difference. The Morrissey family, 4 miles north, lost a section of roof off their cattle shed under the weight of a second storm that came through mid-month. Frank Morrissey was 53 and had a bad hip that the cold made worse, and his 2 sons were both under 12. When the word reached Gideon on a Monday morning through Henderson's boy, who was passing the news along the road, Gideon looked at Naomi and she was already pulling her coat off the hook. They drove north with boards and tools and spent the better part of 2 days helping the Morrissey family rebuild the shed roof before the next weather system moved in. She and Gideon worked. Frank Morrissey's wife, a broad-faced woman named Dora, who communicated primarily through action, worked alongside ceremony. The 2 Morrissey boys handed things up and tried to be useful and occasionally succeeded. Frank watched Naomi work from his porch chair, his bad hip elevated, his expression moving from suspicious to thoughtful over the course of the first day. On the second afternoon, when she was cutting boards in the yard, he called out, "You're Mercer." "That's right." "Kincaid's girl," he said. Then, seeming to hear himself, "The one from the depot." "Yes." He was quiet. "My wife says what he did was ugly," he said. "Your wife's right." I don't know why I didn't say something that day. He sounded like a man who'd been sitting with a regret and decided to put it somewhere. "I was there. I saw it." Naomi kept cutting. "Most people were there," she said. "It's hard to know what to say in the middle of something like that." "Still." "Yes," she said. "Still." He was quiet again for a while. "The Caldwells are Edgar's people," he said, out of nowhere. She paused. "I know." Harrigan's mill is better work anyway, Frank said. Tom Calloway switched to Harrigan 2 years ago, and he hasn't looked back, just so you know. I'll tell Gideon, she said. He should know the whole valley doesn't run the way Edgar thinks it does. She looked at Frank Morrissey, who was looking steadily back at her with the expression of a man making something clear. Thank you, she said. He nodded. Don't thank me. Finish the roof. She finished the roof. The third storm came at the end of November and was the worst yet. 2 days of driving snow and wind that dropped visibility to nearly nothing and kept everyone indoors and watchful. The Archer Ranch held. The stove held. The barn roof, newly repaired, held. On the second day of the storm, with the wind loud enough outside to make conversation difficult, June decided to teach Naomi a card game she had invented herself, the rules of which were elaborate and shifted slightly each hand in ways that June explained as clarifications rather than changes. That's not the same rule as last hand, Ivy said from across the table. It's the same principle, June said. The principle changed. The principle evolved, June said with dignity. Gideon, watching from his chair, put his hand over his face. Naomi played the next hand according to June's evolved rules and won, which June found satisfying and Ivy found suspicious. You let her win, Ivy said to Naomi. I played by the rules as stated, Naomi said. The rules as stated change. Then I adapted. Ivy looked at her with that forensic stare. Then she picked up her cards with a slight adjustment of posture that meant she was taking the next hand seriously. Naomi lost the next hand to Ivy decisively. You were actually playing that time, June observed. I'm always playing, Naomi said. You weren't letting me win, June said, not with accusation, more with the tone of someone confirming a fact for their own satisfaction. No, Naomi said. You played a good hand. June smiled. It was a wide, uncomplicated, unreserved smile, the kind that children produce when they get a straight answer about something that matters to them, when they find that the adult they're testing is going to give them the truth rather than the comfortable version of it. Ivy watched that smile and then looked at her own cards and said nothing. The storm broke on the morning of the third day. The silence it left was immense, the particular silence of a world that has been rearranged by weather and is waiting to see what everyone will do next. Gideon went out first to check the animals. He came back inside with snow on his shoulders and an expression that Naomi couldn't immediately read. Not good, not catastrophic, somewhere in between. The Halcombe place, he said. He looked at her. Ned Halcombe's cattle broke through the west fence overnight. They're scattered across the lower valley. How many? Tom Calloway counted at least 30 head loose when he passed this morning. He's the one who brought word. Naomi was already pulling on her coat. How old is Halcombe? 60. Lives alone. Broke his wrist in October. Not fully healed. Then he can't round them alone. No. Is Calloway gathering help? He's trying, but half the valley is still digging out. Who do we have? He looked at her. You mean, who can we get? Yes, he thought. Calloway for certain. Henderson's older boy. Maybe the Morrisseys if Frank's hip holds. That's enough to start. She pulled on her second boot. We need horses. I know. They went. Tom Calloway was already at the Halcombe place when they arrived. A lean, efficient man with red in his beard and the manner of someone who organized things instinctively. He and Naomi had met twice before, briefly, and he gave her a nod that acknowledged both the meeting and the current situation without wasting time on either. 32 head, he said. Best I could count before the light went this morning. They went southwest mostly, down toward the river flat. They'll be in the timber if they're cold, she said, along the river bend where the trees break the wind. Tom looked at her. You know the lower valley? I've ridden it. She'd ridden the full property boundary twice since arriving, once with Gideon and once on her own. She'd learned it the way she learned everything, thoroughly and with intent, because not knowing terrain was a liability she wasn't willing to carry. She's right about the timber, Gideon said. That's where we found the Henderson strays in the last storm. They split up. Naomi took the river path with Henderson's boy, a capable 17-year-old named Pete who knew horses well, while Gideon and Tom worked the open flat, and Frank Morrissey's older son covered the north approach. The timber was dim and cold, and the snow was deeper under the trees, heavy and wet, and riding through it required a particular kind of patience. You couldn't push too hard or the horse sank, Couldn't go too slow or the cattle would spook into the deeper brush. Pete was good at it. He moved quiet and didn't talk for the sake of talking, which she appreciated. They found the first group of 12 inside 20 minutes, clustered tight at the river bend exactly where she'd expected, their breath making small clouds in the cold air, their collective body heat keeping the center of the group slightly warmer than the edges. She and Pete worked them out of the timber with a steady, unhurried pressure, moving wide to keep from panicking them, bringing them back toward the flat where the others were working. The second group took longer to find, scattered further than the first, individual animals rather than a herd, each needing to be moved separately. By early afternoon, she had mud and worse on her coat, and her horse was blowing hard, and she had not eaten since before dawn. The last stray was a young bull who had found his way into a snarl of brush along a gully and decided, with the absolute conviction of young bulls everywhere, that he was staying there. She worked him for 20 minutes alone because Pete had gone ahead with the others. The bull was not violent. He was scared and cold and angry about both, which is different, but he weighed 800 pounds and had horns and a will entirely his own, and the gully gave him natural defensive walls on 3 sides. She finally moved him by dismounting and going in on foot with a long stick and making herself larger and louder than the gully walls, which worked and also cost her a boot full of icy water when she misjudged the edge of the stream cut. She got him out. She walked him back across the flat, her left boot soaking, her horse plodding patiently beside her, and found the rest of the group already being moved toward the Halcombe fence by Gideon and Tom. Gideon looked at her boot, then at the bull. "You went in on foot?" he said. "He was stuck. He's 800 pounds. I noticed." Tom Calloway was watching this exchange with an expression she couldn't fully read. Then he said to Gideon, conversationally, "She went in on foot for an 800-pound bull stuck in a gully." "I can see that," Gideon said. Tom said. He turned back to the cattle, but there was something in the set of his shoulders that suggested a conclusion had been reached. Ned Halcombe was waiting at his fence line when they brought the cattle in, a weathered old man with a bandaged wrist and the expression of someone who has been standing outside for hours, refusing to go inside because his cattle were out. He counted every animal that came through the repaired gap, with the focused attention of a man whose livelihood was in that count. When the last one was through, he stood there for a moment. 32, he said. 32, Tom confirmed. Halcombe looked at the group of them. Tom, Gideon, Pete Henderson, Frank Morrissey's boy, and Naomi. His eyes stopped on Naomi. "You're Archer's woman," he said. "I'm Naomi Mercer," she said. He looked at her in the particular way of old men who have decided something and are confirming it against the evidence in front of them. "I heard about you," he said. "I expect you did." "I heard Edgar's version," he said. "Tom told me a different one." He paused. "I see Tom's version fits the day better." She met his eyes. "Thank you for saying so." He grunted. "Thank you for my cattle." He turned toward his house, moving slowly on a hip that wasn't much better than Frank Morrissey's. "Come in for coffee," he said to all of them. "I'm not standing out here any longer." She sat in Ned Halcombe's kitchen and drank bad coffee with mud on her coat and a wet boot and listened to Tom Calloway talk about the storm damage across the valley, and heard the names of families who were managing and the names of families who were not, and understood, with a clarity that hadn't been fully available to her before today, the shape of this community, its pressures and alliances, and the places where it was generous and the places where it was not. Edgar Kincaid's name came up once. Tom mentioned it briefly in the context of the Caldwell Mills reduced hours. Halcombe said, "Edgar's got his nose in too many other people's business for a man whose own fences could use attention." Nobody disagreed. On the ride home, in the blue-gray light of the late afternoon, Gideon rode alongside her without speaking for a mile. The valley was beautiful in the low light. She noticed that, even cold and tired, she noticed it. The snow and the timber and the ridgeline and the sky that was doing something complicated with the last of the day's color. "Halcombe's going to tell everyone what happened today," Gideon said. "I know. He talks to everybody. That's what he does." He paused. "He'll tell the story straight. That's also what he does." She looked at the road ahead. "Good. The story he tells is going to be different from Edgar's story." "Yes." He was quiet for another half-mile. "I want you to know," he said, "that the way you worked today, the way you've worked since you arrived, It's not something I expected. He stopped. I thought I was making a practical arrangement. I thought I'd be the one carrying most of it. You've carried your share, she said. That's not, he tried again. What I mean is, I didn't know who I was asking when I made that offer at the depot. I thought I knew what I needed. I didn't know yet what I was going to get. The road curved east. The Archer Ranch was visible ahead, a light in the kitchen window. The girls had lit the lamp. She looked at that light. You said your girls needed someone who stays, she said. I remember. I'm staying, she said. That's all it is. But they both knew, by then, that it was considerably more than that, and neither of them said so, because saying it out loud would require acknowledging something they hadn't yet decided how to carry. The kitchen light held steady in the window ahead. She rode towards it. Her wet boot had gone fully numb 2 miles back, but she'd stopped noticing it somewhere around the time she got the bull out of the gully, and she found she didn't particularly mind. Ned Halcombe talked. She had known he would, and he did, methodically, in the way of a man who had been in a valley long enough to understand that information moved through a community the way water moved through land, finding every low place and filling it. Within a week of the cattle roundup, she noticed the shift in how people addressed her when Gideon brought her to town. Not universal. Martha Greer was still calibrated to a careful neutrality that communicated everything while committing to nothing, but broader than before. Walt Schaefer at the feed store called her by her first name now, without being asked. Pete Henderson's mother stopped her outside the post office and thanked her for how she'd worked alongside her son, said he'd come home talking about it. Old Frank Morrissey, whose hip was slowly improving with the return of milder days, took off his hat when she passed him on the road, which was not a gesture he made casually. The story was changing, not because anyone made a speech or won a confrontation, because the winter had demanded something real and she had provided it, and real things are harder to argue with than rumors. Edgar felt this. She could tell from the way he behaved in town on the 2 occasions she saw him at a distance. A slightly increased attention to who was watching him, a quality of performance in his greetings to people that hadn't been there before. He'd been comfortable for a long time with a valley that accepted his version of events without much scrutiny. That comfort was developing small cracks, and he knew it. December came in cold and stayed that way. The rhythm of the ranch had settled into something she would not have called routine. Routine implied smoothness, and there was nothing smooth about keeping a working ranch alive through a hard winter, but a pattern she knew the shape of, which was different and almost as good. Stove before light, animals before breakfast. Work through the day in whatever configuration the day required. Supper. The slow, difficult wind-down of 2 children who had been inside too long, and a man who had been outside too long, and a woman who was usually somewhere in between. Ivy had continued her private project of deciding about Naomi in increments. The decisions came without announcement. Naomi simply noticed, over weeks, that Ivy had moved from active evaluation to something more like wary acceptance, and then, gradually, to something warmer than that. It showed in small ways. Ivy now sat at the kitchen table while Naomi worked rather than watching from the doorway. She had started bringing her reading to the common rooms instead of disappearing with it. When Naomi repaired something, Ivy appeared at her elbow and watched the entire process without being invited, and afterward asked questions that were precise and technical and revealed a mind that was very good at understanding how things worked. One afternoon in December, Naomi was replacing a hinge on the cellar door, old iron, half corroded through, the kind of thing that breaks suddenly and completely when you've stopped thinking about it. She had the door propped and the old hinge off, and was fitting the new one when she became aware of Ivy standing 3 feet away. "Can I do the next one?" Ivy asked. Naomi looked at her. "You know how hinges work? You line the holes up and drive the screws straight," Ivy said. "I watched you do the chicken coop door in November. There's more to it than that." "Show me the more to it then." Naomi handed her the screwdriver. Ivy fitted the second hinge with the focused intensity she brought to everything, her tongue between her teeth, checking the alignment twice before driving a single screw. It took her longer than it would have taken Naomi. It was also perfectly level when she was done. "Good," Naomi said. Ivy stood up and looked at the hinge with the expression of someone cataloging a success without celebrating it prematurely. "What's next?" she asked. "The cellar latch has been sticking. I need to plane the frame." "I know where the plane is," Ivy said. She did know where it was. She retrieved it without error. They worked the cellar frame together in the cold of the yard, Ivy holding the door steady while Naomi planed. And when the angle was right, Ivy ran her fingers along the edge to feel for the smoothness, the way she'd seen Naomi do, and nodded like a contractor accepting a piece of work. "Papa's been trying to fix that latch for a year," Ivy said. "He's been busy." "You're busy too." "Different kind of busy." Naomi set the plane down. "He's been carrying the weight. I can look at the smaller things because I'm not also worrying about whether the weight will hold." Ivy absorbed this. "Because there's two of you now," she said. "Yes." Ivy tested the latch. It opened clean. She did it 3 times because she was Ivy, and once was never sufficient to confirm a result. Then she put the plane back exactly where it had been. "I think you should stay," she said. She said it to the tools on the shelf, not to Naomi. Naomi looked at her back. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. Ivy turned around. Her expression was composed in the way it always was. The careful architecture of a child who had learned that showing too much of what she felt gave the world too many places to hurt her. "You might," she said. "People leave." "Your mother didn't choose to leave," Naomi said. "I know." Ivy's jaw tightened slightly. "But other people do." "I made an arrangement," Naomi said. "I keep my arrangements." Ivy looked at her for a long moment, the full forensic attention, every lens open. "Okay," she said. Same word she'd used weeks ago, in the kitchen, when Naomi had promised to stay. But it carried different weight now. It had evidence behind it. She went inside. Naomi stood in the yard for a moment, in the cold, and felt something she couldn't quite name. Not quite pride and not quite grief, something that sat between them that had to do with the specific tenderness of being trusted by a child who has very good reasons not to trust. She picked up the tools and went inside too. Christmas came and went with the quiet practicality of people who don't have excess to spend on ceremony. She made the girls each a small gift, a proper book for Ivy, ordered through Walt Schaefer's catalog 3 weeks prior, and kept hidden in the bottom of her suitcase. A set of small carved animals for June that she'd commissioned from old Henderson, who apparently whittled when he wasn't farming. June's response was immediate and enormous, the kind of joy that fills an entire room. Ivy opened her book and held it for a moment and looked at Naomi and said, very quietly, "Thank you." And the weight in those 2 words was considerable. Gideon had made something for Naomi. She found it Christmas morning on the kitchen table, a small wooden box, plain but precise in its joinery, with a fitted lid and a latch that worked clean. Nothing inside it, just the box. She turned it over in her hands. "For keeping things," he said. He was at the stove with his back partly to her, in the way he sometimes positioned himself when he was uncertain about something. "I thought you didn't bring much with you. I thought you might want somewhere to put things, if you collect things." "I collect letters," she said. "Mainly." "Then it'll hold letters." She set the box on the table and looked at it. The wood was a warm amber. She recognized it as a piece of the good timber he'd set aside from the barn repairs. He'd used the best piece he had. "It's good work," she said. "It took me 3 tries to get the lid to seat right." "I can't see the first 2 tries in this one." "No, I burned them." He finally turned around. "I wanted it to be right." She looked at him. He looked back at her, and there was something in the air between them that had been building for weeks. Not dramatic, not sudden, just the slow accumulation of shared cold mornings and difficult work and meals together, and the specific kind of knowledge you develop about a person when you work alongside them through things that actually matter. "Gideon," she said. "I know," he said, which was not a specific response to anything she'd said, but somehow answered something anyway. June came running in from the sitting room with one of her carved animals held aloft, and the moment reorganized itself around her the way moments always did when June arrived. And they had breakfast, and it was Christmas. January was the hardest month, not because of any single catastrophe, because of the accumulation. Snow that came and didn't leave, cold that deepened incrementally until the morning temperatures were serious enough that she did a full check of the animals before anything else. Before coffee even, because in that kind of cold you couldn't afford to find a problem after the fact. The cattle were holding, but the 2 thinnest from the previous season were a constant concern. The milk cow was producing less, which was to be expected but still required adjustment in the family's food planning. The pigs were fine. Pigs are constitutionally difficult to defeat, which she had always found reassuring. The chickens were another matter entirely, but the chickens were always another matter entirely. She and Gideon fell into a working pattern that had no wasted motion in it. She handled the inside animals and the household in the mornings, while he did the heavy outdoor work. They converged on whatever the largest problem of the day was in the afternoon. Evenings were for smaller repairs and the girls and food. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't the arrangement either of them had been picturing when they'd stood in a train depot in October. But it was functional in the way that only things built from actual use can be functional, fitted to the specific shape of this life, rather than anyone's idea of what a life like this should look like. There were hard evenings, days when the cold and the relentlessness of it wore through both of them, and supper was quiet in the wrong way. Not the companionable quiet they'd developed, but the quiet of two people who had run out of words because they'd been spending them all day just to keep going. On those evenings, she sometimes caught Gideon looking at the empty chair that had been Clara's before the table arrangement shifted. Not with fresh grief, but with the older, quieter kind that doesn't announce itself anymore, and has become simply part of the furniture of a life. She never pretended not to see it. She also never tried to fill it. Some things were not hers to fix. One night in late January, after the girls were in bed and the wind was doing something aggressive to the north wall of the house, she was sitting at the kitchen table with her mending, and he was at the other end with the ranch accounts, a process that always made him look like a man reading a letter he already knew the contents of and didn't like. When he said, without looking up, "What did you want? Before all this?" She looked up from the mending. Before all what? Before Cheyenne, before the arrangement. He set down his pen. You had a life before the boarding house. What did you want from it? She held the question for a moment. It was not the kind of question she was asked often, and she noticed that the reason she held it was not because she didn't know the answer, but because she was deciding whether to give the real one. Land, she said. My own place. Not a large one. I never wanted large. Something I could manage and make right and know every inch of. She looked at the mending. My parents had a farm. When they died, there was debt, and the debt took the farm. And I was 18 and there was nothing left to do but go find work. I spent 12 years going toward things I thought might lead back to land, and none of them quite did. He was quiet. And then the agency, she said. And then the agency, he said. The honest reason I answered that advertisement, she said, was because a rancher's wife has a connection to land. It wasn't romance. I want you to know that. I came here for practical reasons. So did I, he said. I know. Is that still true? He asked. For you, is it still just practical? She looked at him directly. He was watching her with the steadiness he brought to things he needed accurate answers about. No, she said. Not anymore. He held her gaze. No, he said. Not for me either. The wind hit the north wall again. The lamp flickered and held. Neither of them said anything further. She went back to her mending. He went back to the accounts. But the room had shifted in some way. Not dramatically, just the way rooms shift when something that has been true for a while finally gets said out loud and becomes more real for the saying. It was Ruth Calloway who first put the larger trouble clearly in front of them. She came by the ranch on a Wednesday in early February, officially to bring back a pie tin she'd borrowed the previous month, actually to say something she'd been working up to for a while. Naomi could tell by the way she sat at the kitchen table. Ruth Calloway was not a woman who sat tentatively, but she was sitting tentatively. I'm going to tell you something Edgar doesn't know I know, Ruth said. And I'm telling you because Tom and I talked about it, and we think you need to know. Naomi poured the coffee and sat down. Edgar's been talking to the Caldwell brothers about the Archer land, Ruth said. Not generally talking, specifically. He's asked them what the water rights on the East Creek look like, and whether the title is clean. Naomi's hands were still on her coffee cup. He's looking for a way to take the land, she said. We don't know that for certain, Ruth said, but Edgar doesn't ask about a man's water rights out of curiosity. He's been doing business in this valley for 15 years, and he knows exactly what those questions mean. Does Gideon know the title is clean? The original land grant was Gideon's father's, Ruth said. Gideon inherited it when his father died 6 years ago. But there was a period where the ranch wasn't operating. Gideon was working elsewhere for 2 years before he came back and married Clara. During that time, the land sat. She paused. Tom doesn't know of any legal problem, but Edgar's the kind of man who goes looking for technical problems, even when there aren't obvious ones. And if he looks hard enough, he might find or manufacture something. Water rights, Naomi said. In this territory, a man who controls the water controls the land that depends on it, Ruth said. You know that. Yes. She looked at the table. What's the creek's source, the east one? Comes off the Henderson property at the ridge. Ruth paused. Henderson Sr. filed on that source 40 years ago. The usage rights flow downstream. Gideon's father had an agreement with Henderson, verbal, as far as Tom knows. Verbal? Naomi said. Yes. Verbal agreements were one of the first things that disappeared when someone with money and a lawyer decided to contest them. She sat with that for a moment. Edgar would need to go through Henderson first, she said. Henderson's not for sale, Ruth said, but Edgar doesn't always need to buy a man. Sometimes he just needs to find a technical claim that bypasses the man entirely. Naomi looked at her. How long has Tom known about this? He heard about the questions to the Caldwells 2 weeks ago. We wanted to be sure before we came to you. Ruth put both hands around her coffee cup. I'm sorry it's this complicated. It's always this complicated, Naomi said. With men like Edgar, simple problems don't hold people still long enough. She was quiet for a moment, working through what she knew about land law in the territory. She'd learned more than most people would expect. Laundry work in Cheyenne had put her in contact with enough lawyers' households to absorb a working knowledge of how these disputes moved, what they required, what they were vulnerable to. He'd need to file a formal claim to contest the water rights, she said. That goes through the Territorial Land Office. It's a public record. Yes. And Gideon would have standing to contest the contest if the original agreement can be substantiated. If, Ruth said. Henderson could substantiate it, if he's willing. Henderson's a good man, Ruth said, but he's also 60 years old and not looking for a fight with Edgar Kincaid. Nobody is, Naomi said, but sometimes the fight comes to you. When Gideon came in from the afternoon's work, she told him everything. She sat across from him at the table and laid it out straight, the way she'd want it laid out if the positions were reversed. No softening, no managing, just the facts and what they likely meant. He listened without interrupting. His face went through several things while she talked. When she finished, he sat with it for a moment. He wants the land, he said, or he wants leverage over it. Control of the water is control of what you can do here. He can't just take a water right he can file a claim that creates uncertainty, she said. Even if he loses eventually, the process takes time and costs money, and a ranch operating on thin margins during a hard winter can't sustain a long legal fight, he finished. No. He stood up. He walked to the window and stood looking out at the yard in the way he stood when he was thinking through something difficult. Not agitated, just still. She'd learned to read that stillness. Henderson, he said. If Henderson will put the original agreement in writing, a signed statement of the history, that makes the verbal agreement into something a land office can see. Henderson doesn't like paperwork. This is his water source too, she said. If Edgar establishes a claim on the creek origin, it doesn't stop at your property line. Gideon turned around. She could see that he'd already understood this, but that hearing her say it made it more operational, moved it from a worry to a problem with a shape. I need to talk to Henderson, he said. Yes. And I need to see the original land documents, my father's grant. He paused. I haven't looked at those in years. They're in the strongbox. Get them out, tonight. He got them out that evening after supper, spreading them on the kitchen table under the lamp while the girls were reading in the other room. The documents were worn at the folds, but intact. The original territorial grant, the inheritance paperwork from his father's death, the water usage descriptions that were part of the original filing. She read them alongside him. Here, she said. She pointed to a line in the original grant. The water rights are described as appurtenant to the land. That means they transfer with the property. They're not separate. He leaned over the documents. Is that solid? It's standard language from the territorial filing period. A lawyer could argue around it, but it's not nothing. Combined with a written statement from Henderson about the historical usage. It makes a real defense, he said. Yes. He straightened. You know land law. I know enough. Where did you... Cheyenne. She looked at the documents. I worked for a family where the husband was a land claims attorney. For 3 years. I listened when they talked at dinner. He looked at her with an expression she was getting better at reading, the one where he was recalculating, not his estimation of her exactly, but his understanding of the full picture of who she was. He did this periodically, and she let him do it, because she was a person who had arrived with no references and a worn suitcase and had never had the opportunity to explain herself before the explanation was needed. Every time I think I understand what you've been through, he said, there's more of it. There usually is, she said. With anyone. He looked at the documents again. I'll ride to Henderson tomorrow. Take the documents, she said. Show him the language. Let him see what's actually at stake. He's a practical man. He'll understand practical stakes better than appeals. You want to come? She considered it. Henderson knows you, she said. The relationship is yours. I'll stay with the girls. She paused. But tell him what I told you about the appurtenant language. Use those words. He'll hear the legal weight in them. Gideon nodded. He rolled the documents carefully and returned them to the strongbox. Then he stood there with his hand on the lid for a moment. If Edgar does file, he said, if it becomes a real legal fight, we deal with it when it's real, she said. Right now it's a warning, not a fight. Warnings are easier. You're not worried? She looked at him honestly. I'm worried, she said. I'm just not letting it be the biggest thing in the room until it earns that. He looked at her for a long moment. I didn't know what I was asking when I made that offer at the depot, he said. It was the same thing he'd said to her weeks ago, and yet it carried something different now. Not explanation, but recognition, the kind that accumulates over time. You asked someone to stay, she said. That part was simple. The rest of it wasn't. No, she agreed. The rest of it was this. She gestured, a small encompassing gesture that meant the kitchen and the documents in the strongbox and the animals in the barn and the two girls in the other room and the long winter and the broken fences and Edgar Kincaid's calculating attention and all of it, all of the unglamorous and relentless complexity of a life being lived in a hard place by people doing their best. He looked at that gesture. Then, without saying anything, he reached out and put his hand briefly over hers on the table, just for a moment, just the weight of it. And then he took his hand back and went to check on the girls. She sat at the kitchen table with the lamp and the silence and the strongbox. She thought about land, about what it meant to have your name attached to a piece of earth. Not ownership exactly, because no one owns land in any final sense, but stewardship. The commitment to work it and know it and answer for it. This land. She knew it now. Every fence line and watercourse and thin spot in the pasture. She knew where the drifts built and where the ground stayed workable in wet weather, and where the cattle naturally gathered when the weather turned. She knew it the way you know a place you've been working for months with your full attention. It felt, she realized, like hers. Not in the legal sense, not yet, and the legal question was exactly what Edgar was circling. But in the way that mattered first, she had put herself into it. She had given it her mornings and her cold afternoons and her planning and her labor, and it had taken all of that and held it and given back something that was slowly, imperfectly, becoming the thing she'd been trying to find her way back to since she was 18 years old and the debt took her parents' farm. She put her hand on the strongbox. Then she went to bed. Gideon rode to Henderson the next morning in weather cold enough to make the horse's breath hang in clouds, the documents in his coat. He came back in the early afternoon with a look on his face that was cautious but not defeated. Henderson's willing, he said. He'll write the statement. Naomi looked up. What did he say? He said, Gideon pulled off his coat and sat down. He said Edgar Kincaid asked him last month about the creek source. Said it was a casual conversation. Henderson didn't think much of it at the time. Edgar's been moving on this longer than 2 weeks, she said. Yes. What else? Henderson said he'll put the full history in writing. The original agreement with my father, the usage terms, all of it. He wants it witnessed. He's going to ask the Morrisseys to witness it, because Frank Morrissey's been in the valley longer than almost anyone. That's good, she said. A witness statement from Henderson in the appurtenant language in the original grant. That's a solid position. He said one more thing. Gideon looked at the table. He said, and this is Henderson, so there wasn't much warmth in the delivery. He said that a man who sends his woman to buy 12 cents of goods and holds her chin up while Martha Greer talks down to her, and then comes and works 2 days on a stranger's cattle and pulls a bull out of a gully on foot in January cold is not the kind of man whose land Edgar Kincaid deserves to take. Naomi was quiet for a moment. He was talking about you, Gideon said. Not me. He said his woman. He meant you. I know what he meant. He said the valley has been watching, not all of it, but enough of it. He looked up. He said Edgar miscalculated when he sent you to Archer's. He thought he was discarding something. He didn't know he was sending you here. The kitchen was warm. The stove was steady. Outside, the February light was thin but present, the kind that promises nothing yet, but has stopped lying about the direction it's heading. She looked at Gideon. He looked at her. We should get the statement drafted before the end of the week, she said. While Henderson's resolved and before Edgar learns we know. Yes, he said. I know. He didn't move immediately. He stayed where he was, looking at her with an expression that had several things in it she didn't try to separate. Gratitude and something warmer than gratitude, and something that was maybe, underneath all of it, the tentative and slightly terrifying recognition that what had started as a practical arrangement on a cold train platform had become, without either of them fully planning it, the closest thing to a real life he'd had in 2 years. Naomi, he said. She waited. He seemed to decide something. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small piece of folded paper, set it on the table between them. Henderson gave me this, he said. He said the woman at the ranch should have it in case Edgar tries anything before the formal statement is ready. She unfolded it. It was a handwritten note in Henderson's angular script, stating simply that the water usage rights on the East Creek had been agreed upon between Henderson Sr. and the Archer family 40 years prior, that the agreement had been honored continuously, and that he would attest to this in any proceeding that required it. Simple. Blunt. The kind of document that didn't look like much until someone tried to take what it described, at which point it became the most important piece of paper in the room. She refolded it. She held it. Put it in the strongbox, she said, with the other documents. He took it and did exactly that. When he came back to the kitchen, June was in the doorway with a chicken under her arm. Gerald, identifiable by his expression of blameless authority, and the particular look on her face that meant something had occurred in the barnyard that required adult attention. Gerald got out again, June said. How? Gideon said. The south board. I fixed that board. Gerald finds them, June said. I've told you. He's strategic. Gideon looked at Naomi. Naomi looked at Gerald. Gerald looked at both of them with the serenity of an animal who has never once in his life doubted his own judgment. I'll look at the board after lunch, Naomi said. I'll hold it while you work, Ivy said from behind June, appearing with the silent arrival that was her specialty. All right, Naomi said. She got up to see about lunch, and Gerald was returned to the barnyard, and the strongbox sat in the back of the kitchen shelf with the Henderson note folded inside it next to the original land grant, and the ranch went on doing what it had been doing since October, surviving, adapting, holding together under pressure, through the combined effort of people who had not chosen each other in any conventional way, but had nonetheless become, somewhere in the long work of a hard winter, something that functioned very much like a family. Henderson's written statement reached the Territorial Land Office in Casper on a Friday, carried by Tom Calloway, who was making the trip anyway for his own filing business, and offered to take it without being asked. Frank Morrissey had witnessed it 2 days prior, sitting at Henderson's kitchen table with his bad hip elevated and his signature produced in the careful, deliberate hand of a man who understood that his name on a document meant something and treated it accordingly. Naomi didn't know the statement had arrived until Tom came back the following week and told her. He stopped by the ranch on his way home, tied his horse at the post, and stood in the yard with his hat in his hand and said, "It's filed. Land Office confirmed receipt. Edgar can't move on the creek without contesting a formal record now, and contesting Henderson's statement in front of the Territorial Office is a different kind of fight than quietly pressuring a struggling ranch." She stood in the yard in the February cold and felt something release in her chest that she hadn't fully admitted was clenched. "Thank you," she said, "for making the trip." "Henderson asked me to," Tom said. "I'd have done it anyway." He put his hat back on. "Ruth wants to know if you'll come for supper Saturday. Both of you. Bring the girls." "I'll ask Gideon." "Ask him yes," Tom said. He untied his horse and swung up. "Ruth already decided." He rode out. She stood in the yard a moment longer. The cold was still real. February didn't soften for paperwork. But the light had shifted in the past week, something different in the angle of it, the way it hit the snow in the afternoon and held a quality that was almost warm, the kind of light that doesn't promise spring but admits that spring is a direction. She went inside and told Gideon. He sat with it quietly, the way he sat with good news, more carefully than most people, as if he'd been disappointed by good news before and had learned not to let it run ahead of itself. It doesn't end it, he said. No, Edgar can still file a formal challenge. It just costs him more to do it now, more publicly, more expensively, with less chance of the quiet administrative leverage he was counting on. She sat across from him. Men like Edgar don't usually want the fight. They want the outcome without the fight. So he might back off. He might find a different angle, she said. But the water rights specifically, I think that's gone as a weapon. Henderson's statement is solid, and Frank's witness makes it harder to challenge. Gideon looked at the table. I should thank them. Yes, both families. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. When I came back to this ranch 6 years ago, he said slowly, my father had let the boundary documents get disorganized. There were gaps in the filing. I knew about it, and I kept meaning to sort it out, and I never... He stopped. If Edgar had moved on this before you arrived, before you looked at those documents properly, you would have figured it out, she said. Maybe, but later, and later is expensive. She looked at him. You can't carry everything alone, Gideon. That's not a failure. That's arithmetic. He met her eyes. You keep saying that. Because you keep needing to hear it. He almost smiled, the full version this time, not the one that didn't quite make it. It changed his face in a way she'd been watching develop over months. The slow return of something that had gone away when Clara died and was coming back differently now, not the same, but real. Saturday at Calloway's, she said. Ruth already decided. Did she? Tom said to tell you yes. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd stopped trying to fully decode, the one that had too many things in it to name individually. All right, he said. Saturday. Edgar Kincaid made his last move on a Tuesday in early March. She hadn't expected a last move exactly. She'd expected a repositioning, a new angle, the kind of lateral adjustment that men with wounded pride make when one approach fails. What she hadn't anticipated was that he would make it publicly, which was either a miscalculation or a deliberate decision to force the issue. She still wasn't sure which. He came into Walt Schaefer's feed store while she was there alone. Gideon was at Harrigan's mill. The girls were at the Calloway place for the afternoon, and she'd driven in for feed on her own because the schedule worked that way, and she'd been driving on her own since October. Edgar came through the door and stopped when he saw her, and she could tell from the half-second pause that he hadn't known she'd be there, but he didn't leave. Walt was behind the counter. 3 other men were in the store, Ned Halcombe, who came to town every Tuesday regardless of weather, and 2 younger ranchers from the north end of the valley whose names she knew now, Briggs and Cole, good workers both of them, not Edgar's people. Edgar approached the counter. He ordered his feed with the ease of a man who owned every room he walked into. Then, as Walt wrote it down, Edgar turned to her with an expression she recognized from the road encounter, the affable reasonableness that wasn't quite either. Miss Mercer, he said, I hear you've been busy. Most people are in winter, she said. I hear you've been filing paperwork. He said it conversationally. Land documents, water rights history. The store was very quiet. Walt's pen had stopped moving. That's Gideon's business, she said, not mine. You've made it yours, though, haven't you? Still conversational, still with that surface of reasonableness. You've made quite a lot of things yours for a woman who arrived with $12 and a reputation for being turned away. She looked at him. She didn't answer. I'm just observing, he said, that you came here with nothing, that Gideon took you in out of, what, charity, necessity, and now you're involved in land filings and water rights and neighborhood business that has nothing to do with Edgar. It was Ned Halcombe. He was standing by the window. He hadn't moved from where he'd been when Edgar walked in, but his voice had the particular quality of a man who has decided to spend something he's been saving. Edgar looked at him. I had 32 head loose in a blizzard, Ned said. This woman found them. Every last one. He paused. In January. On foot, part of it. I know the story, Edgar said. Everyone does. Then you know what it cost her, Ned said. And what it didn't cost you because you weren't there. Edgar's jaw tightened. I've been in this valley 31 years, Ned continued. I've seen men come and go who were big talkers and short workers. I've also seen people who come with nothing and build something real. He looked at Edgar steadily. You told everyone at the depot that she wasn't worth your consideration. I'm telling you now that this valley's considered the evidence and come to a different conclusion. The store was completely silent. Edgar looked at Ned. He looked at Briggs and Cole, who were both watching him with the flat expressions of men who had not yet taken a side but were in the process of taking one. He looked at Walt, who had set down his pen and was standing with his hands on the counter with the patience of a man who has been running a store long enough to know that this kind of scene ends one way or another, and his job is to still be there after it ends. He looked at Naomi last. She hadn't moved. She was watching him with the same steadiness she'd brought to the depot platform 6 months ago. The steadiness that wasn't bravado, just refusal. The refusal to make herself smaller than she was because someone with more social leverage wanted her to. Something moved through Edgar's face. It was hard to name. Not remorse exactly. That would be too clean. More the expression of a man who has been running a story for so long that he'd stopped checking it against reality and is now confronted with the gap between them and is deciding what to do with that gap. He looked at the counter. The feed, he said to Walt. I'll pick it up Thursday. He walked out. The door closed behind him. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Walt picked up his pen. Anything else I can get you, Naomi? He asked, in exactly the same tone he would have used if nothing had happened. That's all I needed, she said. Thank you, Walt. She looked at Ned Halcombe. I was already turned back to the window, looking at the street outside with the expression of a man who has spent something and found the price acceptable. Thank you, she said to him. He grunted. I've been waiting since November to say it, he said. It kept. She drove back to the ranch in the thin March light, with the feed in the wagon bed and the cold still present but different now, less of a weight, more of a texture, the kind of cold you move through rather than the kind that stops you. She didn't know what Edgar would do next. She suspected he would do less. Not because he'd become a better man in Walt Schaefer's feed store. People don't become better in single moments, and she had too much experience with the world to believe otherwise. But because the calculus had changed. The story he'd been telling required a valley that believed it, and the valley had been doing its own arithmetic. She found Gideon back from Harrigan's when she returned, unloading timber in the yard. He looked at her when she pulled in and registered something in her face. What happened? He said. Edgar came into Schaefer's while I was there. He went still. Ned Halcombe was there, she said. He said what needed saying. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. Are you all right? Yes. What did Edgar do? He ordered his feed and left. She climbed down from the wagon. He's not done, probably, but the water rights are a closed door and the store wasn't a room that went his way. She looked at the timber in the yard. What's this for? He blinked at the change of direction. I've been meaning to tell you, he said. He stopped. Started again in the way he did when he was saying something he'd rehearsed and found the rehearsal insufficient. There's a room off the back of the house, south-facing. I've been working on it. She looked at the house. She'd noticed the lumber staging there for weeks and hadn't asked, because some things you wait to be told. Working on it how? She said. Expanding it. It was a storage space. He put his hand on the back of his neck. I've been rebuilding it as a proper room, with a window, south-facing, so it gets the afternoon light. He looked at his boots briefly. I wanted you to have a room that was yours, not the one you arrived in, which was just whoever was last. This one I built for you specifically. She looked at him. It's not finished yet, he said. Another 2 weeks, maybe. I'm not as fast as I want to be. You've been building a room, she said. Yes. While running a ranch through the worst winter in 6 years. In the evenings, mostly, after the girls were in bed. He looked at the timber. I had the lumber from Harrigan anyway. She was quiet for a moment. Can I see it? She said. He took her around to the back of the house. The room was framed and partially walled. She could see the bones of it, the care in the framing, the south window opening already fitted with the new glass they'd ordered 2 months ago. The floor was laid. The walls needed finishing and the ceiling needed closing, and there were details still to come, but the shape of it was clear. It was a real room. A good room. It overlooked the stretch of yard that ran down to the river tree line, the same view she'd been looking at every morning for months through other windows. "The afternoon light will come through here," Gideon said, indicating the window. Clara always said south-facing was the best. She was right. She stood in the unfinished room, sawdust on the floor, the smell of new wood and winter air through the window gap, the sound of the river somewhere below in the trees. "It's good work," she said. "It took me 4 tries to get the window frame right," he said. "The first 3 were—" He paused. "I burned them." She turned around. He was standing in the doorway with his hands in his coat pockets, and his face doing the thing it did when he was saying more than his words were technically saying. "You burned the first 3, she said. "I wanted it to be right," he said. Same words as the wooden box at Christmas. A man with a small vocabulary for certain things who used that vocabulary with great care when he needed it. She looked at him for a long moment. "Gideon," she said. "I know," he said. Same answer as before, still working as an answer to something she hadn't said out loud. "We should talk about the arrangement," she said. "What it is now." "Yes," he said. "We should." "It's not what it was at the depot." "No," he said. "It hasn't been that for a while." She looked at the window. The afternoon light was coming through it exactly the way he'd said it would. Not strong yet, the angle still low, but present, real. "I'm not good at this part," she said. "The saying it part." "Neither am I." "I know what I want," she said. "I've known for a while. I just kept waiting to be sure that it wasn't just the circumstances, that it wasn't just winter and difficulty and being in the same place long enough." "Is it?" he asked. "Just that?" She looked at him. "No," she said. He let out a breath that had probably been in there for weeks. "I want to make it real," he said. "The arrangement, properly, if you want that." "I want that," she said. He nodded. He looked at the window. He looked back at her. He was not a man who produced grand gestures or eloquent speeches. She had known that since the train platform, since the plain offer made on a cold bench with 2 small girls behind him. And she didn't need those things. She needed what he had actually been, steady, honest, willing to be wrong and correct it, unwilling to pretend the hard things weren't hard. "All right," he said. "Then it's real." "All right," she said. They stood in the unfinished room for another moment, 2 imperfect people who had arrived at something real by the unglamorous route of just continuing to show up through difficult conditions. And then she said, "The ceiling boards need staggering or they'll warp." And he said, "I know, I was planning to." And she said, "Show me how you were planning to." And he did. They told the girls that evening. She had thought about how to do this, whether to frame it carefully or let it be simple. She landed on simple because Ivy would see through careful, and June would be distracted by the staging. So after supper, when the dishes were done and the 4 of them were at the table in the lamp's warmth, Gideon said, "Naomi and I are going to get married, properly." June's response was immediate and total. She launched herself off the bench with a force that would have knocked a lesser chair sideways, and she said, "I knew it, I knew it, I knew it," in a continuous stream that suggested she had indeed known it, or had at minimum been conducting a prolonged campaign of hope in that direction. Ivy didn't move. She sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at Naomi with the expression she brought to important things, all the lenses open, nothing held back. "Are you sure?" Ivy asked, not to her father, to Naomi. "Yes," Naomi said. "You're sure you want to stay?" Ivy said. "Not just because of the ranch, because of us." "Ivy," Gideon said. "It's a fair question," Naomi said. She looked at Ivy directly. "I was going to leave in October," she said. "I had $8 for a train south and nowhere to be, but I was going to go. And I didn't go because your father said something that stopped me." She paused. "But that's not why I'm staying now. I'm staying now because this is where I want to be, because of the ranch, and because of your father, and because of you, and June." She held Ivy's gaze. "All of it, not just the parts that are easy." Ivy sat with that. June had stopped bouncing and was watching her sister with an expression of intense sibling attention. She knew, apparently, that this was Ivy's moment and it needed to land properly. "Okay," Ivy said, but this time it was different from the October okay and the November okay. This one had no reservation in it. This one was a door opening rather than cracking, Then Ivy stood up from the table and crossed to Naomi's side and stood next to her chair with a formality that was entirely characteristic, and put her hand very briefly on Naomi's arm, just for a second. Then she sat back down and picked up her book. June burst back into motion. Edgar Kincaid did not file a water rights challenge. March came, and then April, and no filing appeared at the Territorial Land Office, which Tom Calloway monitored with the quiet diligence of a man who had decided this valley's business was his business in the ways that mattered. The Henderson statement sat in the strongbox alongside the original land grant, and after a while Naomi stopped thinking about it every day and eventually stopped thinking about it most days, which was how you knew a thing had passed. Edgar remained in the valley. He wasn't going anywhere. He had too much invested, too many business ties, too much history. She saw him occasionally in town. He saw her. They did not speak, but the quality of the not speaking changed over time. In October, it had been his deliberate dismissal of her. By spring, it was something more mutual. Not forgiveness, nothing that clean, just the acknowledgement that they existed in the same geography and had done each other's character the service of revealing it clearly and would leave it there. Martha Greer at the dry goods store slowly calibrated her careful neutrality towards something warmer. Not an apology. Martha Greer was not an apologizing woman, but a gradual extension of ordinary courtesy that communicated a shift in her private assessment. Naomi accepted it without ceremony. There was no version of this where she needed Martha Greer to formally acknowledge anything. She needed Martha Greer to sell her dry goods and treat her like any other woman in the valley, and eventually that happened. The wedding was in April, on a Saturday, at the Calloway place because Ruth Calloway had a large kitchen and an unstoppable organizational capacity and had apparently been planning this since approximately December. It was small. The Calloways, the Morrisseys, the Hendersons, Ned Halcombe, who came in his best coat and didn't say much but stayed until the end, Walt Schaefer and his wife, Pete Henderson, who had grown 3 inches since October and was now taller than his father and extremely pleased about it. Naomi wore the best dress she owned, which was not very fancy but was blue and fit well, and had been pressed that morning with a care that was its own kind of ceremony. The girls wore matching ribbons in their braids. Naomi had sewn them herself, white with a narrow green edge, 2 weeks prior, in the evenings after they were in bed, by lamplight, with the small wooden box beside her on the table and her collection of letters inside it. Ivy had stood very still while Naomi tied her ribbon. June had stood still for approximately 4 seconds and then asked 11 questions about the ceremony. It was not an elaborate ceremony. There was no church. They used a justice of the peace from Casper, who made the circuit through the valley twice yearly and was a practical man who understood that the people he married were practical people. He read the necessary words. They said the necessary things. Gideon's hand was warm when he took hers, and he held it with the steadiness that was his most consistent quality. Not tight, not uncertain, just present and real. When it was done, Ruth Calloway produced a cake from somewhere that she had made the day prior and kept under a cloth, and June found it approximately 7 seconds after the ceremony concluded and had to be redirected from its vicinity with some effort. Ned Halcombe ate 2 pieces and said nothing, which was his form of approval. Frank Morrissey shook Gideon's hand and then, after a pause, shook Naomi's, which for Frank Morrissey was the equivalent of an extensive speech. Tom Calloway leaned against the wall with his arms crossed and watched everything with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose judgment has been confirmed by events. The afternoon stretched long and easy, the way April afternoons do when winter is far enough behind that you can actually feel its absence rather than just note it. The valley outside the Calloway windows was beginning to show color. Not full spring yet, but the direction of it, the grass coming up through last season's gray. At some point in the afternoon, Naomi found herself standing near the window, looking out at it, not thinking about anything specific, just looking. Ivy came and stood beside her. They stood there together without talking for a while, which was something they had gotten good at. The comfortable quiet of 2 people who had been working alongside each other long enough that silence didn't need to be filled. "What are you looking at?" Ivy asked. "The grass," Naomi said. "Coming back." Ivy looked at it. "It does that every year?" she said. "I know, but I wasn't here last year." Ivy thought about this. "Do you think it's different, seeing it the first time?" "Everything's different the first time," Naomi said. "After that, you know what it's supposed to look like, and you can see whether it's doing better or worse than before." The first time you just see it. Ivy looked at the grass. What do you see? Naomi looked at the valley, the green coming up through the dead season's remains, the fence lines visible in the distance, the timber ridge above, the river hidden in the trees below. The land she knew now. The land she'd walked and worked and worried over and planned for. Something worth taking care of, she said. Ivy nodded slowly. June appeared from behind them, cake in hand despite all precautions, with the expression of someone who has conducted a successful operation. Ivy, June said, you should have some before it's gone. Pete Henderson had 3 pieces. Pete Henderson's is a bottomless pit, Ivy said. That's what Papa said. June looked at Naomi. Do you want some? You haven't had any. In a minute, Naomi said. June weighed the risk of the cake running out against her sister's instruction and decided on one more direct appeal. It's very good cake, she said. Ruth put something in it. Cardamom, Naomi said. I watched her. June looked betrayed by her own intelligence. You already knew. I know what's in the cake, June. That doesn't mean I don't want to eat it. June accepted this and departed with the focused efficiency of someone managing a limited resource. Ivy looked at Naomi. Mama, she said. Just that. Not loudly. Not with any particular ceremony. She said it the way you say a word you've been practicing, quietly, when you finally decided you're ready to say it out loud where someone can actually hear it. Naomi looked at her. Ivy was looking at the window. Her jaw was set in the way it got when she was doing something that cost her something but she'd decided to pay. Is that? Ivy started. Stopped. Tried again. Is that all right? Naomi felt something move through her chest that she didn't try to name, because naming it would have required stopping, and she didn't want to stop. She just stood with it, the weight and the warmth of it, the specific texture of being claimed by someone who chooses every step carefully and had just chosen this one. Yes, she said. That's all right. Ivy nodded. She still wasn't looking at Naomi directly. She was looking at the window, at the grass coming back in the April light. After a moment, she said, The east fence is going to need work before planting season. I know, Naomi said. I've been looking at it. The 3rd post from the oak tree is the worst. I noticed. We should do it before the ground gets too soft. Next week, Naomi said. We'll do it together. Ivy finally looked at her. The expression on her face was not soft exactly. Ivy was not a soft expression child and probably would not become a soft expression adult. And that was fine. It was who she was. But it was open. It was the face of a child who has made a final decision about something important and is no longer holding any part of herself in reserve against a different outcome. Okay, she said, the last okay. The one with nothing behind it, but yes. Gideon appeared at Naomi's other side. She heard him before she saw him, the particular sound of his step. He stood there looking at the valley with them, his shoulder near hers. Ruth's threatening to start a song, he said. Is she good at singing? Naomi asked. No, he said, not even a little. Then we should probably go back in. Probably? Neither of them moved immediately. She thought about a train platform in October, a worn suitcase and $12 and a pointing finger and laughter that bounced off depot walls. She thought about the bench she'd sat on, working out the arithmetic of disaster, and the footsteps that had stopped in front of her, and a voice that hadn't been kind exactly. Kindness wasn't quite the right word for what it had been, but had been honest and had looked at her without the specific blindness that passes for judgment. She thought about fence posts and barn roofs and bad coffee in Ned Halcomb's kitchen and a bull in a gully and Henderson's careful signature and the strongbox in the back of the kitchen shelf and a wooden box made from the best piece of timber available and a room with a south-facing window built in the evenings after everyone else was in bed. She thought about 2 small girls and what it had cost the careful one to say one word this afternoon and what it had meant. There is a particular kind of life that doesn't look like much from the outside. No dramatic reversals, no single glorious moment that explains everything that came before and after. Just the accumulation of honest days, the hard work done without applause, the presence maintained when absence would have been easier, the decision renewed every morning to keep going towards something you believe in even when the evidence for it is mostly just your own stubbornness. She had spent 30 years being told, in various ways and by various people, that she was not enough, not pretty enough, not fortunate enough, not the right shape for the life that was on offer. She had spent 30 years refusing to accept that arithmetic. Not loudly, not with any particular heroism, just stubbornly, practically, one day at a time. She had arrived at a train platform as someone else's discarded mistake and walked away from it toward an uncertain east. And what she had found in the east was not the life she had planned. It was harder and colder and more complicated and more real than anything she had planned, and she would not have traded it. That was the truth she'd arrived at, standing at a window on an April afternoon with her husband's shoulder near hers and her daughter at her side and Ruth Calloway threatening to sing somewhere behind them. Not that suffering builds character, which is the comfortable version people tell when they want difficulty to feel tidy. Not that everything happens for a reason, which is what people say when they want the universe to have done the accounting. But something simpler and less consoling and more true, that you find out who you are in the conditions that actually test it, and that the people worth having in your life are the ones who see what the testing reveals and stay anyway. Gideon had seen her on a bench with $12 and no prospects, and he had stayed. She had seen this ranch at its worst, and she had stayed. The girls had seen a stranger come through their door, and in their own time and their own ways, they had stayed open enough to let her in. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. "All right," she said. She turned from the window. "Let's go back in before Ruth starts singing." Gideon took her hand as they turned, naturally, without ceremony, the way you take the hand of someone you've already decided belongs beside you. The room behind them was full of the noise of people who had been through a hard winter together and come out the other side. And the cake was mostly gone despite all best efforts, and June was explaining to Pete Henderson her theory of Gerald's strategic intelligence with the focused authority of someone who has done extensive field research. And Ivy walked ahead of them back into all of it with her ribbon in her hair and her chin level and her mind already working on next week's fence post. Naomi walked in beside her husband. The afternoon held its light for a long time. The valley had a way of doing that in April, keeping the light past when you expected it, stretching it out across the grass and the ridge and the river timber until the blue of the sky went deep and the first stars appeared in the east before the west had finished its color. She would see that light every year from now on. She would know what it was supposed to look like and be able to tell if it was doing better or worse than before. This year, it was doing better.